Present. Representative Williams,
Present.
Representative Chang. Present. Representative Goulet. Representative O'Leary,
Here.
Representative Henderson,
Present.
Representative Beck. Representative Thompson. Present. Representative Reed, present. Representative Patterson. President Thompson, you have a plan.
Thank you. A quorum has been determined and the state board will now proceed with the meeting. So first, I want to welcome to our March 1st working session of the DC State Board. I want to welcome everyone to our March 1st working session of DC State Board of Education. I want to give a quick recap of our January leadership meeting with OSSI, DCPS, and the DME. Members were sent a report Monday night, late Monday night. A couple of things are true. So in those meetings, the agendas look pretty similar because all of the offices are involved in the work that we have before the board currently. So we made sure to cover social studies standards and the timeline. We made sure to cover budgets and what that looks like. We do hope to welcome the chancellor at a working session pretty soon. Our staff is in contact with them now. We assume it will be the next working session because one of the things we heard, not just from the public, but actually heard from other members of the leadership agencies, as was it would be helpful for the public to better understand how budgets are calculated. So that working session will focus on like how we got where we got with the budget so far. We also talked about the Healthy Schools Facilities Network and how that relates to both the master facilities plan and the boundary study. We are excited both that DME is looking forward to actually using that as part of the master facilities plan and study and continues to partner with us on that. And as we talked about previously with the engagement of OSSI and the social studies standards, the DME's office is also encouraged by that work and will do some, how do I put it, support as far as like getting the word out and encouraging the public to attend and give feedback. Those are all, I think, good signs as far as our ability to collaborate with other agencies. And we'll continue moving that work forward. As far as other work of the board that we came up during those meetings, they fall into the following categories. One is teacher retention. We did get some outreach from Councilman White's office to our staff, inquiring about the teacher retention report in particular from OSSI. OSSI is looking forward to Elizabeth confirming. OSSI will be delivering that report rather soon. We look forward to that. We expect it will be quite similar to a lot of the data of the board's previous versions of the report. So now OSSI does that lift. That will be shared with the council member's office. He expressed interest in his own teacher retention bill. We do not have a bunch of details about that. We do have a meeting tomorrow with the chairman and are continuing to move forward our own education data warehouse bill, which the chairman has already presented. And we have been in conversation with OSSI about. OSSI is supportive of that bill as well as the DME because the place that we can agree is that transparency and data seems to be helpful to knowing when we have challenges and how to solve them. So those are the second thing in that bucket is the board governance report. We did actually get an email back from DME asking for an extension. We know it is oversight. We know it's oversight season. So just like us, many agencies are busy preparing for that. So we do not yet have responses from all of our, I call them sister agencies with respect to the report. Once we have all of those, we will share them. Each agency so far has said that they will be giving us, I guess, their point of view as far as the report as it is issued. So we look forward to that. Last thing in that bucket, what one is? I think that's the last thing in that bucket. Oh, literacy. We did, of course, bring up with Dr. Grant the fact that we see that movie, that work moving along. I know that, thank you, Kathleen, for attending the most recent committee meeting. They do share with us the interest to make sure we are meeting the deadlines that the council put in front of us. And we'll hear later in the meeting, I guess like the most recent, the most latest and greatest from the literacy work. So those are all the things that were discussed in those leadership meetings. Do people have questions about any of those meetings?
You said you're meeting with the chancellor tomorrow?
No, we met with the chancellor already.
I'm sorry, the chairman.
Yes,
What topics is the focus of the meeting tomorrow?
they're pretty much the same. So we tend to use the topics that come up in the working session and just tailor the conversation a bit based on the agency and like their relation to the work. So tomorrow, well, of course, we talked about the teacher retention bill with the chancellor. I know the chancellor did, of course, have a roundtable about DCPS. We'll let him know that we expect the chancellor to be coming to our meeting. We'll update him that like the same updates I gave you all as far as like here's the work we have moving along with the other agencies. The only two items that would be different are ongoing items. So one is, I can't remember which meeting Bernie shared this at, but as a small agency, we are having a really difficult time absorbing the COLA increases. The chairman is doing his best to look at the budget to make sure we can do COLA increases for all of our staff, and it does not come out of our agency budget because we can't cover it. Two, updating him on the progress of our ombudsman and student advocate office space, because he has been really helpful in making sure that moves along with DGS. So we always, and Dan and Serena both come to those meetings and give their overviews every single meeting of like what calls they're getting through their office. That's the difference between that meeting and the other meetings, but the topics will be the same.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then in terms of informing the rest of the board after the meeting, how will we stay abreast of how the meeting went?
What's in the same link?
Okay.
Just like we did for the other meetings. So every month, you will get literally the same leadership report. Those links will be good for every meeting because they're running. So you can, that way you don't have to go fish for every single thing. If there is something that is like urgent, just like we did for OSCE and the update about the public comment, we'll say, hey, this is the decision that was made like now, like OSCE is going to change the public comment people, period, people should know. So we will separate that kind of information out. Other questions? Yes.
You said OSCE is supportive of the data warehouse act.
Yes.
Well, I think
So
that
that's what Dr. Grant told us.
we need to still like see the exact legislation, but I think that in concept, there's a lot of shared collaboration that we see, but I think that it's something that we want to make sure that we cross our I's and dot our T's in terms of the specifics.
Yes, so we were given homework from the chairman to work together with OSCE and the state board to dot the I's and cross the T's, but the general concept, we are on the same page that that is a good thing. And we'll continue to work for OSCE to dot our I's and cross our T's. That's what Dr. Grant told me.
Yeah, we've had conversations and we definitely have some shared alignment there, but there can be always some wiggle room that comes up in the specific language. So it's always important that we don't get ahead of ourselves and commit to things without seeing like language specific.
We'll see new versions.
Or,
Any other questions?
I guess, are there any particular concerns that you would care to share at this moment or no?
Well, there's not a
Right.
text to share with you.
Okay.
Your body language is not saying that you're all in.
I'm leaning forward. Is that not that's a positive body language. I'll have to go to body language school there.
Thanks.
Any other questions from members? All right, seeing none, I'm going to turn to our executive director, Bernice Butler, for her report.
Thank you, President Thompson. Good evening, members of the BC State Board of Education. I have a few updates and reminders, but I will be brief this evening. First, if you requested digital materials for your working sessions and public meetings, tonight is the first time where you will not receive any paper copies of the materials. In front of you, you should have a QR code and a bit.ly code that allows you to access the materials digitally. Please, the staff asks that you return the laminated sheet with the folder so that we will reuse those next month with the same code so that you will have access to the visual materials. If for whatever reason you no longer want to receive digital materials after tonight, please let me know via email. Next, performance oversight and budget hearings are upon us. The state board will testify on Friday, March 3rd for its annual performance oversight hearing, and then Friday, April 7th for its budget hearing. Next Monday, I will submit the 2023 financial disclosure list to the Board of Ethics and Government Accountability. As elected officials, each of you are required to publicly disclose. So they will be contacting you. Please be looking out to your government email address. As a reminder, the state board April meetings do not follow the normal cadence. The April working session is scheduled for March 29th. The April public meeting is scheduled for April 26th. This recognizes several religious holidays and a government holiday and spring break in April. And we will resume our normal schedule beginning the first Wednesday in May. Thank you, President Thompson.
Do members have questions for Director Butler? All right, I am now pleased to turn over the next 30 minutes of our meeting to the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, who will present an addendum to the DC's Health Education Standards to comply with the Expanding Student Success through Period Products Act of 2022. Since the first time the OSSU team shared the menstrual education addendum in January, they have held an open public comment period and received an official letter of feedback from the state board. I will now turn to Assistant Superintendent Brumstead to describe the revisions to the menstrual health standards addendum and share the next steps.
Great, thank you so much.
We never did.
And just before Assistant Superintendent Brumstead hops in, I want to pass around a handout that defines standards and curriculum, because we're going to be talking about two different sets of standards here today. And I know there's been confusion among public. Even when I was a teacher, I didn't totally understand in the beginning. So feel free to take a picture, post it on your media, whatever you like to do.
Andrew, is that enough? Happy to.
No, this is a surprise handout for you that was, we were working to the last second to make sure you had all the best materials.
It's special.
Yes.
Yeah.
I apologize to Executive Director Butler that we did not know that tonight was the first night that you guys were going digital. We didn't mean to quash that surprise. I'm just laughing at you.
Well, not everyone is back away, so we.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And my name is Tia Brumstead. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Health and Wellness at ASSE. If we did not get to meet in January's working session. So we are happy to be back before you today with a revised set of menstrual health standards to continue on our charge to not only follow all of our obligations under the Expanding Student Access to Period Products Act, but also to lead the nation and becoming one of the first states to have explicit menstrual health education standards within their health education standards. So we entered a period of public comment following the January working group session from January 20th to February 20th. This working group period also included doing a listening session with the State Board of Ed Student Advisory Council, which was very engaging as always. And we appreciate Representative Leave and her team for ensuring that we had excellent participation and that they were well prepared to give us all of the feedback that we needed. We also are very appreciative for State Board of Ed's thoughtful feedback, especially regarding the structural and organizational integrity of our standards. We are in the health sector side of things, and we appreciate a close eye on the structural integrity of the standards, as well for how they will be applicable in the to our educators. We received short feedback from Councilmember Pento's office, from various university stakeholders here and abroad, also from a number of healthcare and public health leaders, DCPS and public charter school staff, the general public, to include Several parents, we could identify that some of those parents were DCPS parents based on their comments. Others were unidentifiable. And then we received a letter of support from the National Advocacy Group, period. Okay. You have to get that person. Thank you. Thank you. So what was the feedback? We received very similar feedback that we were able to capture in the following themes. The first theme was to ensure that standards were inclusive of all phases of the menstrual process, to include menopause, and that we explicitly name menopause in order to be in alignment with the law. That we ensure that our standards were degendered and are easily applicable to both menstruators and non-menstruators. We had received much feedback and support that even our first draft was moving towards being degendered, and we continued that work. We also received, again, in the very in-depth feedback from State Board of Ed, specific pieces of feedback and resources to help us ensure that the standards were measurable and demonstrable within the classroom, as well as the standards were demonstrating advanced knowledge and skill or rigor as we move through the grade bands. Additional feedback was related to topical areas regarding pain management and menstrual disorders and irregularities, commitments to diversity and addressing students with disabilities, incorporating parent engagement and education at the school level, and then including ways to monitor and evaluate. Next slide, please. Okay, so what changes were made? I should say that we received overwhelming support for these standards and conceptually did not receive any feedback. So that made us feel very strong that we were in the right direction overall. We did accept all of the feedback regarding specific language in ensuring that our standards are degendered, that we named menopause, that we went more explicitly into naming out commonly experienced irregularities and menstrual disorders, and that we used Bloom's taxonomy and reviewed with other educational stakeholders to ensure that our standards are measurable, demonstrable, and that the rigor adjusted over time or increased over time. Where we did not accept feedback were in specific requests that were applicable, that were not applicable to the knowledge and skills that students need to demonstrate by the end of each grade band. These requests were related to thoughtful and equitable implementation in the classroom level by school leaders, teachers, and their staff. And so we agreed with all of the additional feedback, rate that feedback as we now move, or once vote is given, we move towards full and long-term implementation. So how we provide technical assistance, instructional resources, peer-to-peer learning opportunities for our educators to think about how they address some of these specific issues within the classroom. And also we received some feedback regarding period products and a period poster and dispenser. So the other portions of this act that we are also working on. Next slide, please. I should say too, that's not on this slide as a next step that already happened. We did receive some feedback this morning and we were able to we accepted all of the track changes that we received this morning. And there were 2 additional standards regarding the verbiage and some suggestions, and we accepted State Board of Ed suggestions. And we actually have one standard that we would like to actually bring to discussion right now to get additional feedback on as we work to finalize. If that is okay. Right. So in grade bands 3 through, sorry, yes, in grade bands 3 through 5, decision-making strand, as it reads right now, describe how menstruators can manage their period and period challenges while in class and or curricular activities. So there was a comment today that said the word "there" remained in the final version. And this has been an interesting discussion as we as the OSCE team have also consulted with some of our health experts and our menstrual health advocates around how we worded the use. They're coming at this from different angles, which will probably happen in real time. So it's great that we're talking about it now, where we read this as because all students, regardless of whether they menstruate or not, should know these standards, right? So they should understand how someone who is menstruating might experience challenges unique to being in school or playing sports or being in clubs. But it seems that we haven't gotten the wording that way to where our State Board of Ed team agrees with that understanding from the top line. So one option is we have an advocacy standard where we begin that statement with describe how oneself or a peer. And so we could start it that way, describe how oneself or a peer can manage their period or period challenges while in class and or participating. But we did want to just bring that up to see if there was any specific feedback because this was mentioned twice and we were not, this was the only place where we didn't have alignment.
Like, is there, you don't have to.
No,
Sure.
we just got it back today, so sorry.
Oh, okay.
Do you have copies?
Yes, and then here is one, can we circle it?
Was it included in what you all sent to us this afternoon?
Yes, it was.
Oh, everyone should have a copy of that in your folders. Of the revised data of menstrual standards, the ones that have been shared that have been updated.
And it is in the by grade 5, under the strand 5, decision making. And we actually left the comment there so that it's more easily visible. My apologies for the small font. The copier was not cooperating.
And so I believe page was what page is it?
The first one, 3 and 5 is their strand of 5 decision.
So by grade 5, students should be able to, under column 5, decision making. It's the only standard in that column.
So if you all are looking at the document in your folders, even the folks who had digital copies, because we knew this was the last minute update, it will be on the very first page.
And it says by grade 5 at the top. So that's a little keep, yes,
By grade 5.
under column. So I can repeat the question again too. The question is with the use of their. And by using the pronoun their, does this read, like, do we anticipate educators would be confused and this would read that this standard is only related to menstruators' knowledge versus the law and the implementation of all of these standards are important for all students to gain the knowledge regardless of whether they menstruate?
Well, as it reads down, there is not included, correct? Like the copy I have does not have there. Just as,
Oh, you know what it is, because you don't have the comments and so it hit it. So yours says,
Demonstrate how administrators can manage period and period challenges while in class or participating.
so it does the removal of their work. That's great. That's even better, actually. Does the removal of their work.
Column 5, decision making.
yeah. I think it makes sense. I would, in the second version, you would use the word peers as well. So then it makes it understandable that it's not just the administrators responsible for engaging in that. So then it could apply to like the school community generally.
So yes, we did under advocacy, we speak about it as oneself or a peer. So we could use those words in there as well.
Yeah,
And I think it creates a shared understanding that it's not just because you administrate, it is your responsibility. You know, it's creating a more non-gendered way in which you don't have to administrate, you don't have to understand the impact of what's happening in the particular system. That makes sense. I thought, yes, that was covered by the student community. The overarching thing there kind of covers what all students are covering.
So it looks like two options we have are to say oneself or a peer, or simply remove there. But both of those options would satisfy the board.
yeah, or just saying and peers wouldn't need a pronoun there.
Administrators and peers.
Yeah.
Yes, that was what you wanted to get at.
Or can
There were
manage.
just lots of potential options. Yeah.
Peers can manage period and period challenges.
You're saying-
Yeah, exactly, before can manage.
Okay, the administrators and peers. Would be an option. I wonder with saying administrators and peers though, can manage because that gets, that kind of genders it or puts it towards administrator or non-administrator. I think oneself or a
I
peer.
don't necessarily think that's true.
Is it-
I mean, that's one of the reasons I think this is very important as a father and a young man, well, an old father, but these kinds of things were never talked about with boys at all. Boys had no idea what was going on. Girls did, but the boys didn't have any idea. So I think that, it's, you know, how menstruators and peers or whatever your language, I think that's very important. All right, because I think the great thing about this particular thing that we're doing here is that, because it's going to be, it should be a model for the nation. And because boys need to know this, they have mothers and sisters and all these other women in their lives that, you know, when I was a boy, there was no knowledge of anything like that. I didn't know what was going on. It was a limited couple of paragraphs in my life, all right? And this is fantastic. But boys need to know this. That's why I have another question for you.
Well, we wholeheartedly agree, and I think combining administrators and peers with the removal of there. can address it.
I do have another question. You were talking about training for, because it's gonna, to me, it's a sea change. If the phys ed teachers are the ones that are gonna be teaching this, is that what we're talking about?
Yes, and health education
Health-
standards
health,
really
right.
should be absorbed and felt throughout the.
Okay,
full
so the
community.
health and PE teacher, all right. There has to be a lot of untraining of how they feel or what they know. So I think that's gonna be extremely important, and I understand your hesitancy in talking about it until it's approved, but this is gonna, y'all are gonna have a whole lot of work to do. When is this gonna kick off?
So we expect things to go to vote on March 15th, and we are prepared to begin promotion shortly after. Once they are approved, we do anticipate, and we can even turn back to the slide for some of this, some of the initial release happening this month, pending approval, moving into spring, and then also continuing in late summer and early fall with a variety of learning engagements to both provide awareness to educators and also to begin the actual technical assistance and training around thinking about implementing how one might adapt a curriculum, how one might use tools like the Center for Disease Control's health education curriculum tool to determine if their curriculum will meet these standards. We anticipate this to be a rollout that will take years, that even if we kick off this spring, that there will be some schools that will not be prepared to teach right away. And so we see this becoming a core, being integrated into our core health education portfolio, just like sexual reproductive health and
Right.
alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs are.
Okay, I was just wondering if there was a time frame about when it would be in the classroom. Or when there was, is it going to be a school-wide, both charter and public school kickoff, like it's gonna start in September, August of 2024?
So we plan on kicking off as soon as possible and continuing to support both of educators in both of our sectors. We would welcome a larger conversation at a future date regarding additional kind of, I guess, sort of auditing or monitoring processes. Those were not pieces that have been built out at this point, but we will continue to be looking into.
Have you thought about pilots?
We have started thinking about some of our
I mean,
schools.
pilot right now with the AP, African American course, pilot programs are in the news. A lot of people don't know, they think a bunch of pilots are doing it. whatever. But, I think it would be a good idea to have, before it's kicked off, to have some pilots, to see what doesn't work. So you can learn what doesn't work before you start going out with the whole thing like that. I don't know.
So I think this is where Andrew's handout comes in handy, the differences between sort of standards and curricula. Curricula decisions are not made at the state education agency level, they're made within the LEA and school. When we're thinking about a pilot, we're thinking about how we are not only launching, but then intentionally gaining feedback and how this is looking in schools that demonstrate a certain level of readiness and how they are implementing health education, as well as in schools that are still receiving more assistance. And we do have a clear picture where, clearer picture of where our schools are, as well as once we begin our next core of our health and physical education leadership cadre. Those will be health educators that are exemplars, and they will be selected to a 1.5-year cadre, and we will have the opportunity to support them with implementation, monitor, and get continuous feedback, as well as our additional feedback loops around implementation from our annual school health profiles, completion, and other things to be built out. So we see this in multiple iterations, taking years, but will not be responsible for sort of telling schools when they should start implementing. Our goal here is this is out. You should be thinking ahead of next school year about how to integrate this in the curriculum. It might look different in 23-24 than it does in 24-25. Hopefully it will get better. But we certainly want to provide a multi-tiered framework for technical assistance so we can assist schools in varying levels of readiness with implementing.
Great, thank you.
I want to make sure, did you have, were you finished with the full presentation?
We are.
Okay.
We are done.
Yeah, we're done.
No, it was a beautiful segue into it.
Awesome. Yeah. So I want to start before we get to Lawson, just saying thank you for this work. Like I agree with Representative O'Leary that I think it's important and it's exciting for DC to be leading the way in this. I'm curious, just in the distinctions between standards and curriculum, and then based on what you said, there's a line here that says standards are measurable and demonstrable within the classroom. So can you just share a little more about what that looked like? Because like I'm having trouble kind of visualizing the distinction between theory and practice, and knowing that, how can you ensure that a standard is demonstrable without curriculum?
That is a great question. And we very much leaned in on Bloom's to support us with ensuring the actionableness of each of these standards made sense and progressed over time. Some examples I can give you. We made some changes with the health promotion strands, particularly or specifically from 6th and 8th grade to 9th and 12th grade, where the health promotion in middle school is focusing on students' understanding of the 4 phases of the cycle and identifying factors that might contribute to irregularities. And then in high school, it's deepening students' knowledge of different types of conditions and strategies for managing, for communicating. So it goes deeper than just naming these conditions and what they might look like, to recognizing it to myself, understanding knowledge for myself and a peer, and how to act. Another example is in our middle and high school analyzing influences strands. So in middle school, focusing on how stigma appears in society more generally. And then in high school, students will be examining how stigma impacts administrators, and then even going over into the advocacy, what can they do about it? How they're starting to think about their role in society as being able to positively impact society.
And I appreciate all that, but what I heard you say kind of was like the description of the advanced knowledge. Like if we're looking at how they could evaluate those options, and what would the options look like? Like, is this merely when you were doing this, was this just something that OSSI did on your own? I guess would be the first question. And then 2, was it just a difference in changing the verb on Bloom's? Because to me, that's this point, the ensure standards go deeper over time, not necessarily that they're measurable or demonstrable.
So it was both. I started with the second one. We did go back and determine that the action verbs made sense across the grade bands, that they were increasing with the rigor, and also were appropriate verbs to allow educators to, then create a test or create a classroom discussion where they could evaluate the students' knowledge and skill. And to your first question, yes. Before we came to the board in January with our draft standards, we engaged university, healthcare, and medical experts as well as national advocates on what it is we were talking about, and reading research, hearing stories nationally from youth, looking at our data around, what we know about how young people experience stigma, how they experience access here and nationally, to help us build that roadmap over time.
Can I also just clarify, I'm the person who wrote that demonstration in the classroom part, so I can explain a little bit more about that. There was just a couple of the standard in the previous draft that was the skills and the intention were good, the way they were written. Teachers wouldn't be able to observe them. So one of the examples was use effective communication skills to communicate changes in the mental cycle with parents, guardians, healthcare providers, healthcare professionals, and or other trusted adults. And so the standard is them communicating with their parents or with
Sorry,
healthcare
Kathleen,
providers.
you're far from some of us. You're gonna have to speak up a little bit.
So the comment about being demonstrable within the classroom was more about, as the standards are written, are teachers going to be able to observe that, or is that something that's more about a skill that's being applied in their everyday life? How can we focus those on the skills that they're actually acquiring in the classroom and teachers could assess? So one of the examples of that was use effective communication skills to communicate changes in the mental cycle with parents, guardians, healthcare providers, or other trusted adults. Teachers wouldn't necessarily know if students were communicating with their healthcare provider. So instead, the standard would focus more on what skills or what knowledge the students need to know in order to be able to do that in their life and be able to assess that within the classroom setting. That's kind of what that comment is about.
Thank you for that context.
No other questions from members? Are there questions from members who are online? Are there other questions from members in the room?
One additional, or
Go ahead.
every-
No, I see it's a new business about the resolution.
I'm just curious, could you say a little bit about, so you're asking the board to approve the resolution on the 15th? And then what do you see as the immediate next steps, like after that?
So with approved standards, we are planning a late March launch, where we are going to be reaching out to our schools, to our school leaders, to our health educators or point of contacts at the schools and our community health stakeholders, to remind them of this act and to acknowledge that OSCE has implemented our responsibilities under the act. That not only includes the published standards addendum to our health standards, but also the dispenser poster. With that, we will be planning some initial webinars where folks can come in and just sort of understand and get the high level information. And then from there, building out numerous opportunities for technical assistance and training on an ongoing basis. We also have as the next phase, the public comment, as well as some notes of our own around tip sheets, resources, things that get at some of those ways in which students might experience this in the classroom, the instructional aids that we would like to continue to build out and vet.
And just to clarify, so I remember when you walked in the first time, you mentioned that some things were already underway. So like you might walk into some bath firms and already see posters. Some of the things around the premenstrual products were already underway.
Yes.
Also, so that it'll be ongoing.
Yes, we even received during public comments and photographs from nurses and other teachers that have already taken steps in their schools in support of this. But we've also, I can just show that we've also heard challenges too, particularly at the Black Swan Academy's youth summit they had in January. We've heard high school students at several DC high schools explain how their dispensers have products, but by Wednesday they're on the left. And so there is a need for operations staff to be thinking about how the custodial staff, how they're budgeting, how they're consistently replenishing. So again, notes that we can take to inform our ongoing, not just training, but that's more technical assistance, tips, reminders for schools.
which could wind up being budgetary problem.
So schools received funding last year and for people support this.
That is beyond the scope of
I was just
I see.
thinking when you were talking about stuff in dispensers. We're talking about teenagers. You know, somebody might just empty the dispenser on the first day. Kind of, you know what I mean? That's what I mean about a budgetary. I know that's not your problem, but it's definitely something to think about, because that will happen. If you put dispensers up with condoms, they disappear. They're empty quickly.
I want those to be empty.
I know, but it may just be.
Superintendent Bernstein, can you read the final language, or it's not final, but the proposed language in its entirety again? Yes, so by grade 5, students should be able to, under the decision-making strand, describe how administrators and peers can manage period and period challenges while in class and or participating in extracurricular activities.
That sounds great.
Hearing none. I want to thank you all.
Don't leave quite yet. That's. We got those studies there.
Yes.
We sure do. Good evening, all. It's great to be here again. Elizabeth Ross, I oversee our Division of Teaching and Learning. I'm here joined by my, oh, I'm sorry.
Kathleen, did you have a question?
I'm just thinking about the design. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
I don't,
Is there a
I don't know what I'm here at, not in.
My understanding of,
Speak up, we can hear you.
Sorry, I'm trying to think about it, because I'm not sure what adding or their peers that it was is adding that's not already on their administrators, because the students will describe how administrators and their peers can manage period and period challenges. What's encompassed in peers that isn't under administrators? Because their peers aren't managing the challenges.
well, like as from a teacher lens, like my thought around the peers that I appreciated was like, if there aren't resources in the school, right? Or there's advocacy that's needed, or it's even just support from a friend, or, you know, knowing what signs to look for, or being able to check on someone, then it kind of makes it not just an individual responsibility, but a collective responsibility.
And if it's helpful, I want to remind members that we don't vote at working sessions. So if it is helpful, we can send all 3 of the versions of the language around to members via email for one last round of feedback. So don't feel like, because I know we had a little bit of, literally there were 3 things, and we can pick the best thing. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna shift us to social studies standards. I'm gonna say thank you again. I'm gonna give you all a chance. Are you speaking or no? You don't have to. Okay, I'm gonna give you all a chance to do that, so we don't have to feedback.
they get work.
All right, thank you. All right, so during the next 45 minutes of our meeting, we will hear from Assistant Superintendent Elizabeth Ross of OSSI. She will summarize public comments received to date on the draft social studies standards. She will share proposed edits, implementation next steps, and a tentative timeline for standards approval. The draft standards were released in December 2022. Conversations with the state board leadership extended the initial comment period by 15 days, which closed on February 10th. A Spanish version of the draft standards is available on the OSSI website. I will now turn to, in addition to English version, of course, I will now turn to Assistant Superintendent Ross.
Thank you so much, President Thompson, and thank you to this group for welcoming me back here tonight. I am delighted to be here. I have a robust set of slides to go through, and so I'm going to try and move through them relatively quickly. We really appreciated State Board's thoughtful, thorough feedback and have prepared proposed responses to them. And if we could just keep moving for the slides. Tonight, I'm going to talk a bit about the rationale for updating the social studies standards. I'm actually going to talk first about our responses to SBOE's thoughtful and thorough feedback, which in large part mirrored the public responses that we received. So we thank SBOE not only for doing such a detailed dive into the standards, providing us with high quality feedback, but also for really attending to what the public had to say, for making time at recent public meetings to elevate the public voice. That was really helpful to us in approaching our revision plan. Then I'll talk about our implementation plan and next steps. First, I'd like to spend a little bit of time reminding us of the rationale for updating the social studies standards. OSSE began this work in response to a direct charge from SBOE. We also do this work with a firm sense of where we are in time and how that differs from where we were in 2006, when the most recent version of OSCE social studies standards, the most recent version of DC social studies standards, because of course that predated OSCE, were adopted. And then we are also doing this work in response to an updated and growing research base about how students best learn and engage with social studies concepts, content, and skills. In order to transform from the 2006 to the 2020-23, next slide, please. Thanks, Bernice. Thanks, Executive Director Butler. In order to transform from the 2006 to the 2023 draft standards, OSSE worked with a group of DC educators who comprise the Technical Writing Committee. They drafted standards to include a structure, sequence, and foundation to meet the needs of 21st century students. In 2006, the standards could not have included online media in the same way that our current draft standards do. Additionally, the scholarship on effective social studies education has shifted significantly since 2006, and the resources available for educators, in large part because of the rise of the internet, have expanded significantly. Further, the 2006 standards lack adequate rigor and utilize significantly verbs such as identify, describe, and explain. The volume of content is so broad in the 2006 standards that we understand and hear directly from educators and LEAs that there has to be cherry picking happening in the classroom in order to ensure that students are learning content, which necessarily means that certain standards are prioritized and elevated while others are not fully included. Additionally, Indigenous, Black, and LGBTQ+ history is often hidden in the 2006 standards, and students lack adequate windows and mirrors for understanding the world and seeing themselves. Next slide, please. There's some significant pedagogical shifts that we made in the draft standards, and it's important to ground this conversation in these pedagogical shifts in order to understand the proposed revisions that we intend to make to the draft. We've heard lots of calls from the public for inclusion of specific content within the standards. At the outset, I want to note that the shift towards inquiry-driven social studies that use content as a vehicle to develop social studies skills and civic dispositions is deliberate. It's by design, not an oversight. The draft standards purposefully reject the expanding horizons model of elementary education. The expanding horizons model is this idea that you learn first about yourself, then about your family, then about the community, then about the world. We purposefully reject that model and instead focus on historical thinking, geographic inquiry, and civic engagement to provide space for educators to ask students key questions, things like how does context impact content and whose perspective is missing. The draft standards emphasize student agency and support students in developing a deeper understanding of core social studies concepts, including geography, culture, history, and economics. This kind of learning deepens student understanding of content while focusing on transferable skills that students can use outside of the social studies classroom. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk a little bit about distinguishing standards and curriculum. Standards, these are two important related topics, but they are distinct. Standards establish the minimum expectations for what students should be able to know and do at each grade level, while curriculum provides specific learning activities and assessments that educators and LEAs can use to measure the extent to which, first to implement the standards, and then to measure the extent to which students are understanding the standards. Developing strong standards is only the first step in ensuring that educators are able to implement them well, ensure that students are learning. OSSE is committed to developing a robust set of ancillary supports, including sample concept and concepts, a primary resource bank, and professional development modules that demonstrate the essential skills of social studies education. And I'll be talking later in this presentation about our implementation plans and the additional supports that we're developing for educators. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk a bit about OSSE's plan for revising the standards. We disseminated earlier this week a lengthy document just shy of 100 pages that details the public comments that we received and OSSE's proposed response to those public comments. Appreciate that you may well still be going through that document and would be, of course, happy to continue to discuss that in the coming weeks and in future working sessions. Our conceptual priorities for standards revision. We needed a set of conceptual priorities in order to determine how to respond to public feedback. And first, we centered the guiding principles. With every revision, proposed revision, suggested change, we evaluated the extent to which it would bring us closer to the guiding principles or farther. When it would bring us closer, we were much more inclined to propose making that change. We also worked hard to make sure that revisions are aligned to the fewer, clearer, higher call. That call was quite clarion in the SAC's guiding principles, and we want to be sure that we are providing LEAs and providing educators with standards that a reasonable number of standards that can be implemented within the course of a student's K-12 trajectory. We also were very mindful of ensuring vertical alignment across all standards with specific and have revised specifically. We requested feedback in two forms. We requested feedback on the clarity of standards and then specific written feedback. And where standards received low numeric scores for clarity, we are prioritizing revising them because we want them to be clear. And finally, we are attending to the extent to which standards reflect best practices in social studies and inquiry-driven education, ensuring that revisions in the standards are not in opposition to practitioner and expert reviewer feedback. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk through the thoughtful, thorough feedback that we received from the State Board of Education on February 16th. There's a fair bit of content to cover, and I want to be mindful of our limited time and leave time for questions. Because this feedback came from this body, what I'm going to do on the next set of slides is name the topic of feedback and then spend the presentation talking about OSSE's anticipated response. First, SBOE provided feedback on student civic engagement. OSSE intends to respond to this feedback by ensuring that we are including a global perspective in Action Civics. We will add a driving concept that is dedicated to students evaluating the best way to take action on a global scale. This will also provide an opportunity to expand student study of global humanitarian crises, including the Holocaust, which stakeholders have shared should be given explicit additional coverage in the standard. Next slide, please. OSSE received feedback from SBOE on higher order thinking and refining the position of standards language. OSSE intends to respond to this feedback by continuing to review and revise the language of the standards for clarity and usability. I also want to particularly thank SBOE for the really strong graphic visuals, which helped to highlight for us areas where there were opportunities to increase clarity and usability here. They will help OSSE to fully respond. Next slide, please. OSSE received specific feedback from SBOE on environmental literacy. OSSE agrees that environmental justice is a critically important component of US History 2 and Grade 8 Action Civics. We appreciate SBOE's recognition of the importance of including environmental literacy, and we were also delighted to hear today warm recognition and public testimony from an environmental advocacy organization, Casey's Trees, that they appreciated the way that environmental literacy and climate change is incorporated in these standards. Nevertheless, the Grade 8 Action Civics course is explicitly designed to facilitate educators in choosing specific topics to cover through the lens of each driving concept. So educators may well choose environmental policy as the lens for teaching driving concept 4. Power and access to power power and access to power in society. But OSSE does not intend to further incorporate environmental literacy in this course. However, we will be prioritizing including ancillary materials to support educators in including this specific topic, environmental literacy, as a case study. Additionally, as SBOE specifically highlighted, the US History 2 does not have a standard labeled as human environmental interaction. There are several standards that encompass this theme, albeit under a different anchor standard, some examples of which are listed in this slide. Those are the examples: US 2 Inquiry DC 22, 35, 42, 72, and 75. OSSE does not intend to add additional standards to US History 2. However, we will ensure that environmental literacy resources and materials are incorporated in ancillary materials for educators. We are also revising the anchor standard system, which we will share more about in a later slide. Next, moving on to digital literacy. OSSE appreciated SBOE's specific feedback about digital literacy, and we agree. Media literacy is critical for all students. We'll incorporate this skill into all grades. We also think it's quite important to distinguish media literacy from technology literacy. For the purposes of social studies education, media literacy is the skill of helping students understand the limitations of online information and how to fact check unfamiliar content. These skills parallel historical thinking skills and naturally align with social studies content. Technology literacy encompasses ideas of copyright laws, digital marketing, and online safety. We're committed to ensuring that students understand how to identify misinformation and how to build committed to building robust supports for educators in teaching these skills. We're developing, upon adoption of the standards, we are dedicating resources to developing communities of practice, perhaps more so than the other standards. Digital literacy skills will need to continue to grow as the digital world and digital context continues to change. We're also intending to support a robust coaching model to support this content, because we know it's an area that educators will continue to need support in order to implement well. Next slide, please. OSSE received specific feedback from SBOE on humanizing language and historiography, as well as interrogation of evidence. We really appreciated SBOE's attention to humanizing language. This was another area where the graphic visual displays that SBOE provided were quite helpful in highlighting for us where there were opportunities to strengthen the draft standards. We will revise the standards to make further updates, particularly in the upper grades, to incorporate humanizing language even further. Next slide, please. OSSE received specific feedback from SBOE on white supremacy and hard history in the United States. We were really glad to receive this feedback. We're reviewing and revising the standards in response to it to ensure in particular that the rise in impact of Islamophobia and AAPI hate is fully incorporated. We're also updating a global opportunities for action driving concept in grade 8, that grade 8 action civics course, and clarifying the role of white supremacy in US History 2, global concept 3. Next slide, please. OSSE received specific feedback from SBOE on democratic principles. In response to this feedback, OSSE is expanding driving concept 1 in action civics 8th grade action civics and driving concept 1 in US government and civics to include an increased focus on this theme. We will also revise the content of US History 1 and US History 2 courses to include a greater focus on democratic principles. Finally, we intend to include robust ancillary resources for LEAs and educators to implement standards related to these topics with fidelity. Next slide, please. A reevaluation of the anchor standards labeling system. As I've already referenced, we do intend to pay careful attention to the anchor standards. We received this feedback from SBOE and appreciated it. We also received it from members of the public and intend to shift the anchor standards to function similarly to the standards for history and social science practice in Massachusetts, which have been highlighted for us as a best practice. Social studies is interdisciplinary in nature, and OSSE is excited to ensure that the anchor standards further support educators in using these standards. To that end, we're developing a document that outlines the vertical articulation of skills for each grade band. Next slide, please. Vertical alignment of content and skill was another area where SBOE provided specific feedback. In response to this, OSSE is carefully reviewing the standard to ensure that content that appears in different grade levels is significantly differentiated. There is one area in media literacy that I want to highlight why we will be maintaining identical language throughout. Research on media literacy and skill standards suggests that learners understand in different ways as sources increase in complexity in each grade level. And it's incredibly important that students have multiple opportunities to practice these skills throughout their K-12 experience. Accordingly, OSSE is going to maintain the language in this standard across grade levels to ensure that students have an opportunity to practice those uniform media literacy skills as they continue to engage with media content of increasing complexity. Next slide, please. Oh, and again, in regard to OSSE's response to SBOE's feedback on vertical alignment of content and skill, OSSE appreciated specific feedback about the different levels of granularity across grade bands and is doing a careful review of the standards in order to ensure that both stylistic conventions and the level of granularity are consistent across grade levels. We will address World History 2 and Grade 6 Global Geography in a later slide, but are committed to making sure that the level of granularity in each course is consistent, both in a vertically articulated manner, but also with the goals and methods of teaching each course. OSSE received specific feedback from SBOE on scaling back the thematic approach to standards. In response to this, OSSE is committed to right-sizing the thematic approach across these standards. We understand the concerns regarding the thematic approach to World History 2 and Global Geography. First, in regard to Global Geography, OSSE designed Global Geography and the educators who served on the TWC to allow a case study approach to the teaching of questions like urbanization, like border policy. To clarify this, OSSE will update the language in each standard so it is clear that the standards do not ask educators to consider an entire content of study, but instead a specific region, country, or city within a content for each standard. And an example of this revision is included here on this slide, where you can see we are shifting from current standard 6 inquiry 22, analyze contemporary issues facing people of Africa and identify characteristics and causes of these issues, to analyze at least one contemporary issue facing one region or country within Africa and identify characteristics and causes of these issues. OSSE is also in the process of fully revising World History 2 in response to feedback that we received from the public and from this body, and will more clearly define the canon of content that we expect to be covered in that course. Next slide, please. OSSE appreciated specific feedback from SBOE on reframing global perspectives, history, and culture. In response to that feedback, we are working with experts from the University of Pittsburgh and our educators on the technical writing committee to reframe and revise this course. It's critical that these standards continue to reflect the priorities of DC educators while also providing the appropriate lens and supports for educators and students to engage in a truly global understanding of the world. We will also expand the global focus in grades 4 and 7. And as I mentioned in response to Action Civics, include a global Action Civics driving concept in grade 8. Next slide, please. We received specific feedback from SBOE, and here too, SBOE's feedback was quite aligned with some of the public feedback that we received, that there was an opportunity to even further include underrepresented groups. OSSE really appreciates that feedback. This is also an area where we received some response from students, and we were delighted to receive that. We think that's the very beginning of Action Civics in action, even before these standards are finalized. We're deeply committed to furthering the inclusion of underrepresented groups and are carefully reviewing our standards to make sure that the history, experiences, and joy of Latinx, AAPI, and queer individuals and groups are included. We're also working with our expert reviewers to identify additional places to explicitly include underrepresented groups in our standards. And we're expanding the standards to include a focus on religious history and the evolving definition of citizenship. Next slide, please. OSSE received specific feedback from SBOE around economics and financial literacy. In response, I appreciate the approach to talk to you here, or the opportunity to talk to you here tonight to clarify our approach to financial literacy. The current draft of the social studies standards prepares students to understand systemic economic inequality by ensuring that students know the roots and causes of the current economic system and includes specific standards regarding redlining, resource distribution, and discrimination. Those are the standards that are excerpted on this slide. Our current standards also provide students with skills to evaluate information about financial products through media literacy. However, OSSE does not currently have any specific standards about credit scores or investing because these are beyond the scope of the social studies core sequence. Nevertheless, we appreciate state boards advocacy. We know that this is an issue that's of importance to DC. We've had conversations with council on this topic, and we are certainly open to exploring the development and adoption of standalone financial literacy standards, as well as the timeline for that work upon the conclusion of our work on social studies standards. Now I'll turn to specific feedback that we received from the public. We received significant engagement to the public, and again, I really want to elevate and thank the state board for making time at its public meetings to allow members of the public to provide both written and verbal testimony in response to the feedback. As this group knows, our public feedback survey closed on February 10th, and we were delighted to hear from a range of DC educational stakeholders, including and primarily educators and administrators representing all 8 wards of our city. In response to the public feedback, OSSE will provide some broad overview highlights. And again, the best place to go for a detailed review of the public feedback is the memo that we circulated earlier this week. Public comment is never uniform, but in general, we can characterize the public response to the standards as incredibly thoughtful, incredibly thorough, and incredibly responsive. We would also like to take a moment to formally, publicly recognize the incredible work of the Technical Writing Committee, which again is comprised of DC educators who have thoughtfully drafted, revised, and edited the standards, and who we are continuing to work with to edit the standards in response to the public feedback that we have received. The work of the TWC has led to standards that are truly an example for the nation, and we're grateful for their continued time, energy, and engagement in this space. Next slide, please. As I've said before, drafting standards is only the first step in the process of transforming social studies education in the district and realizing the promise of the guiding principles. OSSE is working hard to ensure that educators and LEAs have robust supports in place to implement these ambitious standards. Next slide, please. OSSE's first priority in implementing standards is ensuring educators have high-quality instructional materials, which regularly engage students in historical practices support students in conducting inquiries, and present a rich diversity of perspectives and experiences, as well as being culturally responsive. Next slide, please. To ensure educators have the necessary supports to implement the social studies standards, OSSI has allocated $500,000 to develop a comprehensive set of ancillary resources for LEAs. These resources will include sample content and concepts, which move beyond names and dates, and also include sample instructional experiences and assessments. OSSI is working to create a resource bank with this set of supports and ensure that educators have sets of age-appropriate texts and resources to use with their students. We are also working with university experts to develop communities of practice, including in digital literacy, and to develop look-for modules that model best practices in social studies education for K-12 educators and for school leaders. Next slide, please. We're nearing the end of the presentation, and I've included a sample here of how OSSI is planning to develop curricular supports for each standard. We have one standard here. So the standard itself evaluates the causes and consequences of the Mexican-American War with specific attention to the impact of the war and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on the Mexicans and indigenous peoples living in the newly acquired American territories. Then that anchor standard that drives the standard, and then some examples of supporting content, and then examples of what a rigorous assessment might look like, and a task that does not meet the standard. This is still a work in progress, but because each standard is supported by an anchor standard, it puts us in a position as a team where we're then able to support, and the educators that we are working with, where we will be able to support the educators across the district in identifying a supporting content and then determining what rigorous assessment is like. We are also planning to work with curriculum developers and educators from across the district to ensure that educators and LEAs have the materials they need to both develop comprehensive curriculum and to assess the extent to which students are mastering the supporting content. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk a bit about next steps. So in between, when public comment period closed, we have been working to revise and update the standards in partnership with a technical writing committee with subject matter experts and with expert reviewers. On March 28th, we'll convene LEA leaders to begin designing supports and preparing for implementation. And I apologize, this slide was put together before we received the update about the April meeting. On March 29th, we would be delighted to come back and share with you where we are in this work. Thank you for the opportunity to present this information tonight. I appreciate I moved through quite a bit of content quite quickly and that you have quite a bit more content in your inboxes. Thank you to Executive Director Butler for sending that around. I'm happy to stop now and take any questions.
I'm sure we had a number of questions. I do want to know for people who have folders in front of them, you do have an additional graphic because I anticipate that people will have questions. I think it's definitely for producing this today since we landed on since we have next steps. These are all of OSSI's next steps. We did our best to incorporate for you all what the board has to do in between OSSI's next steps. So you have a sense of like what it takes to get from step to step and then to pilot. So I'm gonna note that it's not that OSSI omitted it. OSSI didn't have it reproduced. Okay. I have more comments. Member questions? Yes.
The public comment memo, is that available to the public? And is it comprehensive? It seems very thorough. Is that everything?
Thank you so much for that question. It is not yet available to the public. However, OSSI does intend to publish an overview of changes and the comments that those changes were in response to, along with the final set of standards. When we get there, we're in the phase where we are working quite quickly to make those adjustments. In terms of it being comprehensive, it does include every single type of comment that we received from the public, there are of course spaces where we received comments that were duplicative. And so it does, if we received a comment that was duplicative, we include that only once.
And just to be fair, we are trying to make it a little bit more manageable for the public. So we're trying to, that's why it's not quite on our website yet. We're still working to refine it to try to 100 pages a lot for anybody. So trying to, it'll still be long, but make it a little bit more manageable for the public.
If it's also helpful to remember, so all of them, so for some, I know you're on your computer. But people have virtual versions, these agendas are public. So the things you're scrolling through, those materials you can link to, the public can link to as well. So if somebody went today to say, hey, what's on the SBOE's agenda and is watching the working session and listen to what Assistant Superintendent Ross talked through, all of that information is available to the public now.
But that one document is not, correct?
It's on the state board's
It's on the
website,
state
but
board.
It's on the state board's website, so it is available to the public, but not. through the
That is.
Yes, that is.
Okay.
Alrighty, a few thoughts. The first was, the environmental literacy. I was curious about the rationale here of like, oh, an LEA can choose healthcare to evaluate government function versus environmental literacy. And it was kind of like, well, do we leave that up to the LEA for such a interest, like a topic that's very, I guess, very relevant to like students learning? And then I also had the second question of, is this one more of a science standard? You want me to just look at all my questions first and then you want to provide it? Okay. Digital literacy. Okay. Is this a possible area for separate standards or do separate standards already exist? Just kind of looking at, like, I have people who are in school and like students can't type, but everything is on computers. So I'm just curious, with the response here about digital literacy, is there a thought of like, just maybe it's not appropriate for, I'm not sure what I would do there, but are there current digital literacy standards? And if so or not, then is there consideration for possible separate literacy standards? The next one is slide 29. Ossie will clarify the role of white supremacy in U.S. history. And I was curious about, I guess my initial reaction was, is the white supremacy beyond U.S. history, and how is that point considered throughout somewhere else in the document? I know you mentioned like decentralization of European something, but I was just, that kind of caught my eye. Oh, and then for financial literacy, I am glad you all are not adding financial literacy to social studies standards, because I can see economics being more appropriate topic than financial literacy, but curious of, will this topic pop up somewhere else? And I believe that's all my little sketches. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of those questions. And in taking them in reverse order, in regard to financial literacy, we are working really hard to make sure that where there are opportunities to strengthen the economic standards that are included in this in the draft social studies standards, they are as strong as possible. Economics is a core social studies discipline, and we want to be sure that that's fully incorporated in regard to financial literacy and the question of whether that could live elsewhere. Ossie is open to exploring standalone financial literacy standards. We are excited to have that conversation with this group and with others. This is an issue that has been elevated for our consideration by members outside of this group as well. And so our priority now is finalizing the strongest set of social studies standards in the country, but then we're excited to talk about financial literacy standards and a potential timeline for moving forward with that work. So in response to question 4, the answer is yes. In response to the question about white supremacy, you're being interested in how and where else we are engaging with.
Yes, specifically called out for U.S. history, but I was kind of like, I'm sure it's beyond U.S.
It is absolutely beyond just U.S. history, and we are really interested in making sure that students, one of the areas of feedback that we heard from this group and also from the public was that there is an increased opportunity to globalize the standards. And white supremacy comes up across the board, not just in response to US history. So the answer there is yes. In response to digital literacy, there are standalone technology standards. ISTE has standalone technology standards they're not something that we've formally adopted, but would be happy to have a conversation at a later date about whether that might be appropriate at some point in time. And then in regard to environmental literacy, the OSCE is in a position where in supporting LEAs and educators in implementing these standards, we are confident that our provision of resources is going to help drive high quality implementation. And because we intend to provide specific resources around environmental literacy, are excited to see what implementation looks like in response to those resources. I'm sorry?
Is the environmental literacy more of a science thing? Is that why it's kind of like?
The environment is certainly something that science standards cover, but particularly through 8th grade action civics, which takes a case study approach, there is a real opportunity for educators, for LEAs to work with their students on issues that are of local importance. And so we are trying very hard, as with all of this work, there's always a balance, but in particular, in regard to grade 8 action civics, the goal of that course is to support student agency and educator agency. And so we are trying really hard not to be too prescriptive about what topic the students need to engage in.
So about the action that it's project-based learning piece. Okay, so then where would environmental literacy pop up?
Yeah.
What you guys say?
So environmental literacy in production civics would really be more about environmental advocacy or advocacy for environmental policy potentially, right? Obviously students would choose because it is not a partisan course. And so there's a couple of different strands where it would be really, really appropriate for an educator to choose environmental policy as a lens, as long as it's relevant in the shifting political landscape. Particularly the one we've suggested, and we actually write this in the driving concept of that standard, is the power and access to power in society, because the questions of environmental justice are particularly interesting from that lens. And we're going to write very specific resources for educators to use that. And I'll also add that a lot of places with the environmental literacy standard, I'm going to talk about a lot of places with the environmental literacy standards are popping up are places where like society is interacting with the environment and they're affecting each other. So maybe indigenous peoples live a specific way because that makes sense of the environment. And 4th grade is a comparison between different food sources or housing for Inuit people versus people who live in Arizona. So like the environment is affecting society, and then vice versa with some of the environmentalism things or other ways people are in turn affecting the environment. Affecting the environment, and so it's more about that relationship and like adapting as opposed to the science, which is.
I want to move us along a little bit because I know a lot of members have not had the opportunity to ask questions. So did you have other answers you wanted to provide? Okay. Other member questions? I know I have a couple.
If not, I have one more.
No, there are more. Representative Williams.
Sure. So I appreciate the responsiveness to each thing in particular. You've mentioned kind of a right sizing of, content, and heard a lot about, we're getting away from a lot of, specific information. It's a challenge to try and figure out depth first breath and all that stuff. How are you going about that process of like giving teachers and LEAs enough information to know, hey, I can find additional materials on this without omitting important things?
I so appreciate that question, Representative Williams, and we're doing it in 2 ways. So first, we have, as I mentioned, the feedback that we received not only from this body, but also from the public truly can be characterized as thorough and thoughtful. And where we are hearing from multiple parties in particular that there is omission. We are taking very, very careful look, working with the TWC, working with the experts, and in large part incorporating that specific omission, because we want to be sure that there is not core content that should be included that helps drive the concept underlying the standard that is not included there. So first is actually through revision of the standards. The second way that we're doing it is perhaps even more important, which is by working directly with educators and with LEAs. And that work has been ongoing for the past couple of years with the technical writing committee, but really starts in a wholehearted way with our convening on March 28th, when we are pulling together LEA leaders and social studies, content experts at LEAs, in order to take a careful look at the standards, figure out exactly what kind of resources are needed, and then working with smaller groups of content experts, both educators and individuals from institutions and universities, in order to identify that core content and those core concepts. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I'm heartened by like the iterative nature of it. You know, I think if you continue to like respond to specific things, and we can see this as trying to make a really craftsman-like product that is continually responsive, then I think it will continue to get better and better. And so like that's where I think the process is more just as important as the final product, if we want something to really be good. I do want to like make a plug that I didn't see in some of the comments. With regards to the democratic principles piece, I know there's been big shifts in the US history changes, but I haven't sensed anything in terms of like the development of democracy, right? And so we're talking about the fragility of democracy, we're talking about, you know, the beginnings of democracy, but then like also like how it has developed. And then like I don't think younger students or middle-aged students really understand the importance of democracy unless you compare it to places around the world that don't have it. So it's like, if you don't understand why it's so useful, so that's like a particular content piece as a social studies teacher. But I think some standards that I've seen in other states too also focus on the role of Black Americans uniquely in expanding civil and voting rights. And so I'd like to kind of see that be pushed into earlier grades too, because if you're expecting kids to take action in action civics, they have to have a foundation for that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I will say the placement of action civics in 8th grade is not by accident. That is very, very intentional. We want students to be going into that work with a strong basis. And the point that you just raised is quite consistent with the call that we heard from this body and from the public to include a greater focus on globalization. And so I just really appreciate the point that you articulated in terms of highlighting some of the unique benefits of a democratic government system as compared to some of the global alternatives.
Thank you. And we just want to echo what Representative Williams said. I think it's been a great process. I think you're listening to everyone. And one thing that I just wanted to ask about was the issue of, we had testimony about how, you know, when you have an event, you learn the lesson from the event rather than having a theme. And the lesson, you know, and the theme is learned from going through historical events timeline. And I thought that was kind of the way that I would think through it. I think it was Laura Fuchs gave that testimony. How has that been incorporated in, if at all, into this process of trying to, you know, garner some of these lessons from the events? And I think she was speaking about the Iranian Revolution, which I thought was an event that people could learn the same lesson from. And I feel like if you're looking, you know, in a region, and then you're looking at events within the region, you're going to be able to get those lessons. The kids will learn the lessons, but it'll be easier if it's in the context of a timeline that flows through that region. But I mean, has that been incorporated at all? If so, how?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Representative Goulet. And I will say we really appreciated the public feedback that we heard at the public state board meetings. And that feedback was also mirrored in the written feedback that we received, which was quite detailed. And we are working hard to incorporate. In direct response to those comments, we are significantly revising. I would say it's among the most significant revisions that we are making to the standards in response to public feedback. World History 2, which is where where we received a lot of that feedback. We're working with external experts to ensure that the core content is accurately reflected in that course. At the same time, there truly is by design a thematic approach to these social studies standards rather than we are working hard to get away from the heroes and holidays type social studies standard that some other jurisdictions do use. And so I think the response to your question is it's a both and. We're making specific discrete adjustments to World History 2 in order to ensure that the core content is fully included, that it is not going to be left out, but also we want the standards to continue to, we want students and educators learning under the standards to continue to be able to use ongoing world events in order to understand how to leverage their social studies skills. Something that we were talking about internally in our office was the devastating earthquake happening in Turkey and Syria. Under our social studies standards, studying that current event could actually be a geography lesson where students are talking about where borders are drawn, why those borders are drawn there. And if the standards were written and finalized 2 months ago, that opportunity wouldn't exist because yet. So it really is a bit of a balancing act where the answer is both. We're making specific adjustments to World History 2 in response to that feedback, and also working hard to maintain the thematic approach to our standards.
And one last question here, if I may. What kind of research and empirical data did you do in terms of deciding we needed the thematic approach in terms of being able to educate kids better? Like what made you make that shift that you saw in terms of teaching kids history and social studies?
Yeah, so our response to drafting these standards really was driven by the direction established by and adopted by the state board in the state board advisory committee, which came up with the guiding principles and calls for fewer, clearer, higher standards that enable students to leverage or that expose students to both windows and mirrors and enable them to engage with content differently. So it is in response to that. I will say it is also reflected in best practices for social studies, history and learning. It is one of the differences in the way that researchers and scholars understand the way that students learn social studies as compared to, I think maybe the clearest way to see this is moving away from, the expanding horizons model in elementary school, the idea that first you must learn around self, then family, then community, then world. As the research and scholarship in this space has continued to evolve, we are working hard to make sure that our standards reflect that.
Are there any questions?
I have one additional.
Okay, I'm gonna ask my three first. So I've asked them yet. So first, I want to make sure that I'm understanding where in the feedback. I'm making the assumption that the changes to World History 2 fall into this category of reframing global perspectives, history, and cultures. Is that correct?
Yeah. It is, and also it really does mirror some of what Representative Goulet just shared. We are working hard to ensure that that core content is not omitted.
And then my second question, comment and question around financial literacy. I would say the financial literacy charge included in the social studies standards did not come from the board. The reason the board commented on the financial literacy because when we actually it was a dialogue with council about financial literacy being included here. We have heard from the public, and I know there are specific council members who are really interested in making sure we have financial literacy standards. And I do think there's an opportunity, not in the social studies standards. I was honestly very surprised to hear any reference to inclusion in the social studies standard. But to get a little bit clearer on when and how that might happen. So I don't know if there's anything that is helpful to share now, or if that's something that we need to put on our docket to address. But what my fear is I don't want it to be legislated. I think just like everything else, we should go through these public processes like this. Because we've gotten really good feedback and have had a very, very iterative process with the public. So I always want a good thing. But I fear nothing after it was said, it was going to be here is a problem.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. We are very, very interested in exploring options, adoption and timeline for standalone financial literacy standards. And the reason why it is hard to talk specifically about a timeline for that work is because we have a couple of different kinds of different engagement that we've done with the state board on standards development. And depending on the extent to which we're developing something from whole cloth versus working with something already existing, that timeline changes really rapidly, but it is something that we are very interested in further exploring, and so glad to hear that this has felt like a positive iterative process. It has for our team as well, and certainly our interest is to continue to work with the state board on our standards work.
And we share your interest in not having it legislated. We feel like this is the appropriate process to go about that. So certainly share that desire.
I think my follow-up comment to that would be, I know we've been in conversation with the grant about getting a clearer cadence for provisions overall. Like, it's not ideal that our standards are teenager old, like that's not best practice. And so I would assume that things like new types of standards would be something we'll be able to explore together with OSCE as we start to establish, we are going to review standards every X amount of years, so we don't have outdated instruction. My last question, I noticed in public comment, and as you said, I think it's never going to be perfect, like it's never going to be completely aligned. Like everybody's not going to show up and say the same thing. A comment about the standards being too broad and then them not being broad enough. Where is OSCE landing on like any changes to the broadness or number of standards in response to the public comment, or not making changes to that?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, President Thompson. This too is a space where State Board put together a beautiful visual that really helped us see what we were hearing from the public. In grade 6, we see significantly more standards than we do elsewhere, and so we are really interested in looking particularly for opportunities to streamline standards that are duplicative. And to make sure that the amount of content that we expect educators to cover, students to know and be able to do in each grade is appropriate for the school year. In terms of balancing those comments about precision and broadness, it is always a balancing act. This is where the style of feedback that we got from the public is quite helpful. So we did 2 things in putting out the standards for public comment. We asked the public to rank the extent to which the standards for each grade, excuse me, not to rank, but to assign a rating to the extent to which the standards were appropriate for each grade, and then also to provide written feedback and to each standard. And we received a range of responses across the board, but where we are hearing from multiple commenters that, for example, there's a key topic missing or something that needs to be highlighted in a different way, we are trying to be responsive to that request for increased specificity, while simultaneously maintaining the commitment to fewer, clearer, higher, because we frankly want to get away from a world where we have standards where LEAs and educators are selecting which ones they actually have time to cover within the cadence of a school year. We want to get to a set of standards that are rigorous but also achievable.
Okay, so housekeeping note, we are 10 minutes over for this section. Are there any members who have not asked a question, who have a question? If there are, I'm assuming there are additional questions. If they are not questions we have to ask tonight, can we also just have a list of questions that we send to Aussie and get comment back on? Because
You can put them on the parking lot.
we can also put them up on the parking lot, but my guess is, since it's a lot of material, people will also have other thoughts. And so I do want to make it a big enough window that if members start to have additional thoughts, we can also convey those thoughts and questions to us. Does that sound like a way forward? Are we comfortable with that? Or is there like a burning question that like doesn't get asked right now tonight? Somebody's gonna die.
Well, it's not a really-
Okay, you didn't ask the question. Okay, but you got it.
It's not a thought, it's a reality. This is, has been very educational. And I think the thing that sticks out to me is how responsive Ossie was to our question. And, I want to thank you for that, because from all the revisions that are promised, you got to do it. But all the revisions that are promised this is a very fluid document. It's definitely headed in the right direction.
Thank you very much for that feedback, and Madison Cantor on my team really deserves the credit for the hard work on that front.
All right. I think that's
Thank you.
a perfect closing thought. We're going to.
That's at the LEA meeting of 28, Aussie has extended the invitation for state board members to join that. So if you would like, you all just let me know, we'll do all the names.
That would be excellent, and please follow up questions through Angela. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time tonight and for the grace in going a few minutes over.
No worries. So so typically we have a 5-minute break now. I want to honor that, because if our humans are not going to be like, we're over, no 5-minute break. Thank you, Aussie, for the presentation. Many of us look forward to seeing you on the 28th. I do want us to pause for the 5-minute break. It is 6:42. Please be back here at 6:47. Excuse me, we will start again. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm gonna, well, it's.
to the DC Council. Her budget includes funding for all the agencies under her control and independent agencies like the State Board. The budget will be released to the public in a few weeks. In previous years, the State Board has provided the mayor and council with a letter indicating priority areas for support in the budget. It is my intention that we do so again this year. We will use the same process from last year because it worked well, to ensure everyone's ideas are heard and discussed. SBOE staff will populate a jam board to help facilitate the discussion. I will recognize each member and ask them to name their top 3 budget suggestions. While we do that, staff will record the items on the jam board so all members and the public can see them. Once everyone names their priorities, we will discuss which to include in a letter. I'm just gonna go in order because that way I don't miss anybody. I'll get confused. So I'm gonna start with Ward 1. Representative Williams.
I need to find that document before I can. Yes,
What's that?
there was a letter or an email that was sent that had the board's budget priorities.
For last year.
That was last year.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did share a memo, we did share the letter from last year with members, from last year's priority. I'm asking you all this year,
Mhm.
what are 3 things that are important to you
Okay, so I
in your
can,
ward? Yes,
so I'd say student safety, particularly safe passage,
okay,
student mental health. And then I think still would think that teacher salaries and staffing issues are a huge concern.
thank you. I'm gonna go to Ward 2, yes. There will be
When we
discussion.
list these themes like this, right, it's, I mean, mental health means all kinds of things. It means, does that mean having more social workers in school? Does that mean, right, I think there's a lot that's packed in there. I don't feel comfortable with us sending a letter or a rec that's just thematic problems, right, that we need to solve, but rather specific things that we're asking for, right? I mean, that's ultimately where this is leading, no?
Correct, so we will list the things first, then we will see, because it can't be, priorities can't be everything. We're then gonna have some discussion about which ones to delve into and what they mean.
Okay,
So like, if everybody goes on this table and says mental health, we
gotcha,
can talk about what that means.
okay,
If maybe I say, I'm just gonna make up something, I want some special education program for Kimba, my Shih Tzu, and nobody else says that, guess what, we don't need to discuss the educational program for Kimba.
so keeping the bricks.
Yes.
Okay, so then literacy,
Mhm.
mental health, public safety.
Thank you. Representative Goulet.
So I think the biggest thing for me, based on parent feedback, is trying to increase the per school funding that they receive right now. Many schools across the city are taking 5% cuts. That's a big hit for particularly small elementary schools. And it's not just a problem in Ward 3, it's citywide. I think the high schools fared a little better, but you know, at the elementary school level, schools are taking a large hit. So I think adding 5% to every school's budget would be something that I would fully support. I think that that's the ask of the parents that I've heard so far. Issue 2 would be making sure that we fully implement pre-K 3 and 4. Our goal 15 years ago was to have universally available pre-K, and that we wouldn't think of 3 and 4-year-olds as preschool anymore. We would think of them as pre-kindergarten, and that would just be school. And they would be able to walk or bike to their neighborhood public school and attend school as a 3 and 4-year-old. We started with Title I schools, but we failed to fully implement it. So I think making sure that as we do the boundary study, we fully implement the vision of universal pre-K. And then, you know, if I had to mention, you know, one more priority in this, I think it's school safety as well. I think the decision to remove SROs is deeply concerning from the schools. It's the #1 issue that principals raise. And I was just speaking at a committee of the whole, a public hearing today, And there was 4 principals on the panel, and all 4 mentioned is that one of the top things was making sure that we don't cut SROs from schools and that they're essential for maintaining a safe environment. So I think those 3 things would be things I would highlight.
I'll piggyback on the safe passage. For Ward 4, that's a primary topic for parents, students, and educators. I think that in Ward 4 right now, the key topic is why doesn't DGS do what they're supposed to do in our school building? All of our school buildings, even the new ones, even the brand new ones, have major problems with leakage, with HVAC problems. I'm not even talking about the 3 ancient buildings in the Ward 4. I'm talking about the ones that have been renovated. I think that is that a topic?
Facilities is a budget item, yes, cost money.
I think those are, I'll just mention those 2.
Representative Henderson.
School-based mental health, teacher retention, literacy. But I would also like to see, like, maybe we could also just broadly address like overall adequacy of funding.
Okay, so it sounds like you're taking the third from Representative Blueberry.
Sure, thank you. Appreciate it.
We're a team, we know.
What was the last one, Representative?
Just like overall adequacy of our budgets, school budgets.
Representative Best, I know you're on the phone.
He had to step out for a minute.
Okay. I'm gonna, I guess I'll wait. Representative Reed.
Sure. Oh, quick question. We are gonna ask for a budgetary enhancement for SBOE or the student advocate. Is that backlog?
Is that something you want to list in your
I was
priorities?
wondering before I add that to my list of priorities. If you're already gonna consider.
I'm asking for work priorities right now.
Okay. If we don't work priorities, I mean, that is a work priority because we have the highest number of calls to the SBOE and making sure we're adequately staffed.
Okay, that's one.
Where did that one, funded basic programming needs, like we're still making hard decisions for, should they pick social security personnel, mental health personnel, a teacher, so, funded schools based on what they need, and then I would do public safety.
All right. Student representatives, who also get to have their priorities. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped Representative Patterson, he is on the phone, so that'll give y'all some time to think. Representative Patterson.
I appreciate that, Madam President, for remembering me. The 3, I think I text them to you as well. I said out of school time funding, would like to see more funding around there, school-based mental health. And then I want to be a little bit more specific on safety. I would like to see a closer connection between violence interrupters with LEAs and funding to allow LEAs to have them specifically have access to their school. So beyond just having safe passage, which I believe there's funding for and they report to a department, but to actually have more funding around violence interrupters being directly connected to LEAs.
Yeah. OSG, literacy, and the staff funding stuff that Representative was talking about. Sorry, the staff funding stuff that Representative was talking about.
Adequacy.
Yeah.
Okay. Representative Best, are we back?
No, ma'am.
Okay. When Representative Best is back, will you all let me know? Because I can't.
Yes, ma'am, I will. I'll ask him to send them to you, ma'am.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, he can text them to me as well. So my 3 will be school-based mental health, safety, and adequacy of the budget. School budgets.
Look,
It's very small. But I can make it bigger.
Yeah, we can make it bigger. All right. Alex, I'm counting that small.
Right on it.
This way we know where to focus our discussion.
Everybody go, except
Yes, except where we're doing that.
I'll have him text them to you, ma'am.
Thank you. So I think I am the student safety. What's that? It's more liberty for.
adding this to my.
this thing goes into NFC too.
I would agree.
I would. Out of school. Time.
I was agree.
If I can try that.
You can move it into one of them.
Yeah, like group them under different headings.
Okay.
So Q2.
While Alex is doing that, a couple things are important here. For one, I believe the record is actually still open for the DCPS budgets. If you want to submit testimony on DCPS budgets and care about adequacy, that might be a good time to do so. Two, the oversight hearings for today for the education cluster, this is another opportunity because oversight and budget go hand in hand. Three, if you members also can do their own individual budget letters. I sent down on Monday, I will forward it, I meant to forward it, but I've been traveling. I literally got up a plane and walked into working session, so I will forward mine this evening. So members are welcome to also send their own budget letters. We will focus the discussion tonight on the things that had the majority of residents for members, so we can drill down there. We will, of course, then the staff will help us draft something to send to the members, as we will get more and more specific. But we cannot, time is of the essence, so we want to prioritize our policy. Since safety was a clear winner, I want to start there as Alex is moving the others. So I heard expansion of the passage within that. I heard some conversation around violence interrupters. I heard SROs on the table within that category. I don't know if anyone wants to like lean in first on what they see is like important in that bucket, or if things that I listed are like, I would not like to see that like in our letter, right? Because that's on the table too. So it is open for discussion. Yes, so I'm gonna go Henderson first. You got the first.
So I didn't speak to this topic at all, but the Office of the Student Advocate in their annual report has a section on safety advocates. So I'd like to introduce that into the conversation. I think that's a category that we could talk about. And the next section, I believe, is about restorative justice coordinators in the schools. Just want to add that into the mix.
I would, so for people who are, some people I hope are familiar with the safety advocate, in the resolution we passed in November, safety advocates was, I think, like the third recommendation that we encourage as part of the youth safety resolutions. So it is something that we actually, if we included it, could reference as far as the board has supported in the past. It's also in my, I included that in my budget letter. Other thoughts?
So you said we can also do things that we don't think should be adopted by the board or be recommended by the board in this letter.
Yeah, so like, let's say I say, like, again, like, I'm using Kim as an example because I don't want to step on anybody's activity. If I say under safety, I want Kimber to have a bright vest because I'm worried that he's going to get lost, a bright vest and a whistle. And that's just my thing. And the rest of the board is like, no, Ebony Rose, that should not be there. I would want you to say that to me, like because we have to get to a letter that is reflective of
the body.
Yeah, so I think, given that, well, this is, I'm not talking about Kimberly's best, but.
Right. Well, I put Kimberly.
Yeah, no, of course. I think dogs should always have two clothes. Anyways, I think that one of the things that was brought up that I strongly think that the board should not engage with or include in our letter is suggesting that SROs receive more funding or be implemented in schools. In July of 2020, we adopted a resolution that talks about taking police out of schools. There was a really long meeting. It went to like midnight or something. I wasn't there, but I watched it since. And it has a bunch of advocacy from students about how detrimental having SROs in their schools were. So I think that instead, and I think that if we were to adopt that, like if that is what the majority of the board agrees with, we'd have to go through the resolutions SR 20-10 and resolve all the things, or figure out a way that the board can publicly resolve these things, so that it doesn't make sense for us to make these comments and then say, but we should include funding that allows for the retention of SROs. So I think before, like if we were going to do that, which I would argue we shouldn't, but if we were, we have to go through this resolution pretty heavily. It's like 3 pages long, and resolve all those things and talk about why maybe they don't apply to this situation. But also I recommend any members who are thinking in favor of that to go and watch that board meeting. Not all the public comment is about SROs, but there's a lot of really powerful comment from students in DC. Like I said, this meeting went on until midnight. It's on Zoom, or it was on Zoom, but it's on the YouTube. It's July 2020 public meeting that kind of talks about why maybe though some principals or some administrators might want it, why it might actually resolve safety issues within the school and why it doesn't build trust. So that's, I think, where we can turn to alternative forms of kind of addressing these issues. So that's the one thing that I'd like to put out there.
I think we're unlikely to reach consensus on that here.
I agree.
So,
I would like to just speak in support of it, though, I think, and here's why, is that this was the number one thing mentioned by principals, that they said was the most important thing last budget cycle. And then, I've spoken with principals this budget cycle, and this comes up first, and it's not prompted. As I say, what do you need? And they said the SRO program. 4 of the principals mentioned it, this year. And I think we've made mistakes not listening to public safety experts on these. In this case, the principals are charged with keeping order at the school. They're charged with making sure that the school runs smoothly. And I'm not in any way, dismissing the concerns of the students in this case. I think they were very good advocates. I know that they came to speak to the council too, and the council passed a law on this. I mean, my concern is that the council passed this law, but has no alternative right now. We literally are on track to cut the SRO program by 1/3 each of the next 3 years, but have nothing to replace it with. I mean, issues of crime in the city are up, and it worries me that we're not listening to our principals on this. And we're cutting it, the SROs, without a backup plan. We have no backup plan that I've heard that's been identified that's going to take this place in school year 23-24.
And Madam Chair, may I speak as well? Because I specifically to the point that you guys are making right now, because I have my hand up.
Yes, thank you for that, because I can't see your hand. I'm gonna let Representative Burstead respond. I'm gonna go to Representative Patterson, and I have a comment about this as well.
So then what I think we should be thinking about is possible resolutions to the gaps that are being left. Because I think one that is just more within like our capacity as a board is to think of and forward solutions to like the changes that have been made through council legislation or whatever. But then I also think that a lot of times it's easy for, not easy, I shouldn't say that. I think that a lot of times going back to a system that we've had in place to kind of search for control over these situations or over school violence is really easy because these situations are really scary, right? We don't want to feel like students are unsafe in schools. But I think that the problem arises then where when SROs were in school or when SROs are in school, they unfairly target students who are already like Black girls in schools are 30 times more likely to be arrested by an SRO than any other student. And I think we need to be very mindful of that we can have like alternative forms of kind of addressing the community needs that aren't carceral, because most of the research shows that like non-carceral responses, like responses that don't involve police officers or SROs or whatever we call them, people with guns and police badges, are more effective in like curbing violence and creating like more sustainable solutions and relationships with the communities. Because the piece that wasn't missing, or the piece that goes missing when we don't have an SRO, is not that we no longer have a police officer in the building, it's that we don't have that same community member. So we can replace it with another community member or forward an alternative solution. I think that would be much more beneficial, and I think that the capacity of the board is more targeted towards supporting something like that.
I want to go to Representative Patterson.
Thank you, Madam President, to Representative Bernstadt and to Goulet's what they just made, what their comments that they just made. The reason that I specifically started to speak about violent interrupters, because during my day job, I work with violent interrupters in the two schools that are the high schools that we have. And we're one of the only LEAs that actually have violent interrupters, have a contract with violent interrupters. And the difference that it makes that they're able to actually build relationships with principals and to kind of fill the gap that some of the things that happen or the mistrust that's with SROs, and build relationships with students, specifically students of color who feel like they may not can trust an SRO or where that may go because of the responsibilities, but they can build relationships with violent interrupters. And then violent interrupters, the ones that we currently have a contract with, actually talk to families as well. So it's not just the student and what's happening at school, but also making sure that they're safe as they go into their communities. So I want to specifically name that, because we do it a little bit different than most schools, because we're one of the few schools that actually have that kind of relationship with violent interrupters. And I think the more that you can do that, the proven for us is that crime will decrease, for the simple fact that they have those type of relationships. There's a sense of confidentiality that they carry with them that we allow them to have. And it really allows people to speak to these people, to be mentored by them, people that they know that know their communities, and can also coordinate activities with principals, because we've had incidents where we've had students that were threatened from outside entities in their community, and they've put together safety plans so those individuals could go home, as was testified in when we had growing up at our meeting. So I wanted to be very specific, because that's something that we do a little bit different with our violent interrupters, as opposed to just having them show up and be on the corners. They actually are part of the planning of safety for students. They work with SROs, they work with principals and other deans in schools. So I wanted to name that and to say that's something I believe that should be replicated and explored.
So my thoughts. I do think that we have to have a conversation around the responsibilities that SROs have and which of those need to be picked up. Because it's not about like necessarily, like for me, is it a police officer? Because SRO's responsibilities went beyond, like they were not in the schools to just lock up kids. Nobody wants kids locked up. I will use myself as an example. I got a call from someone in the mayor's office who was a moker, who was like, there's a shooting outside of our ground, which I already knew. And they said, can I get the principal's phone number from you so we can have the school locked down? Because we have to let the school know to lock down outside of the school. The person who previously would have done that was the SRO. That is a gap that is unacceptable and we have to fill. So I think we do need to have, to Representative Bernstadt's point, a fuller conversation around what are solutions we need to see moving forward, which also addressed a lot of what Representative Patterson put on the table, what he's seeing at school, and what Representative Goulet is describing as far as what his principals are seeing and feeling. Like those concerns are real. And what we did is we said, hey, we're going to reduce the number of SROs, but we did not say what we were going to put in place to pick up all of the public safety responsibilities. If we go back actually to the resolution that was passed in November, and I appreciate Representative Henderson raising the Office of the Student Advocates report, two things I think are true, or could be true as possible solutions to this. One, could be a safety advocate position. Because they can be the person that does the programming. They can be the person that does the coordination. I actually think it's really important that that person be a public safety official, because there's certain information that public safety officials get, like from MPD, like, and MPD does have civilian employees that do community engagement. It can be a civilian that's in MPD, but it's the person who calls the school and says locked down because they're shooting outside. And one thing I know I could never have on my conscience and my heart is because we were so focused on the SROs in particular, that we as adult people did not put stuff in place to keep kids safe. So I do think there are things we can point to and can look at. The other part that was in that resolution was about coordination. We have a lot of resources going toward violence intervention, violence interruption, all the things. And we are super execution and coordination poor, in my opinion, because those people are not talking to each other. One of the things that was recommended in that resolution, there were a bunch of things. It's a long resolution. I literally went to every single one of my ANCs and asked them to pass a mirroring resolution, and they did. Was, could we do some type of task force, council committee where they have to talk to each other? And could the student advocates also be the people who are like the on the ground people who are saying, hey, say passage workers, what are you saying? Hey, there's a one's office person in your high school, because that's true too. Like, what are you saying? Which students are you talking to? Hey, you also happen to be in a Cure the Streets and a area for the violence interrupters. There has to be someone who is connecting those dots, or else what are we doing with the information? It's no good. So I think some of those solutions, which the board has adopted and did do a lot of work, both talking to students, talking to the one's office, talking to the student advocate, using data, can start to fill this gap. But I absolutely think there is a gap that we need to fill, and I think it's something we can fill. So that would be my 2 cents. Representative O'Leary.
Just gonna follow up on what you're talking about. When we had the panels about this, and I encourage the new members of the board to look at that meeting, because there were people from ones, there were people from violence interrupters, and just what President Thompson's talking about, there were all of these different agencies in the room downstairs. But, and I think one of the questions I asked, do y'all ever talk to each other? Because they don't. And that's the problem. It's not that like that the safety advocate, that the student advocate has a paperwork and all these proposals for this, what they're doing. Is it Denver?
Yes.
It's Denver, right? Boulder, Colorado. Okay. It's a really nice template for that. They don't have guns. They're members of the school community. And what we have to have is a new solution for this big problem that we have, which carries over to, like, we had 2 students from John Lewis Elementary in Ward 4, which is right across the street from my house. They were involved in those 2 shootings on Georgia Avenue. Luckily, they didn't get killed. But the trauma that brings back to that school the next day, and I was there the next day, affects every single human being in the building and in the community. And so we have to do something. We have to do whatever we can do as a board, and we know what we can do and what we can't do to heighten the or raise the temperature of the leaders in this city.
Thank you, Representative O'Leary. I think Representative Best is this a good time? Is it a good time? Am I right? Or am I wrong?
That's correct. I can speak now. Thanks everyone for giving me your time. I've been thinking about this issue for quite some time, and I don't, obviously this isn't necessarily within our realm of what we can control, but I firmly believe that there should be a unit within the department specifically around school safety, officers who haven't necessarily been in the department for too long, to ensure that they aren't indoctrinated or beat down by the system, where they would be trained in communication and on ways to communicate with our students, and on ways to directly support students to keep certain elements outside of the school, and specifically hired for that purpose. So it's just something that I've thought about for a little bit of time, especially when I hear all of the the statements about some of the challenges people have had with SROs. And I think this could be one of the steps towards alleviating some of those challenges. That as well as in coordination with the violence interrupters.
In listening to you all, I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is, back in 2008, 2009, foreclosure market happened. And when I was at Cap City Fellows, one of the things that I led was this foreclosure mitigation. But there were community development people, there were education people there, everyone is at the table. And so I don't know if there needs to be thinking about what is the funding mechanism to do some type of school violence mitigation task force or committee, and to recommend funding around that has a deeper conversation around the solutions. Because I think people are well versed in the problems. But like, how do we get someone to like actually put budget money to facilitate the conversation to move the city towards solutions? I think that is a place that money could be very well spent. Because I feel like there are so many different places, and it just, people need to talk. And I don't know how else you get people to talk unless you put money to make that somebody's job to talk and to push the city towards solutions.
I mean, I think the good thing for us is we obviously don't have unanimity on this, but everybody sees it and solving it. The other thing though is this really isn't a budget issue in terms of dollars and cents. I mean, they're going to have something budgeted in that area. This is not necessarily a dollars ask, but how you shift resources. I mean, if SROs aren't in schools, they're going to be out of control. So I think, we could look at this as policies separate apart from a budget letter if we can't reach agreement on it. And that would be fair, but I think this will come up in the Budget Support Act. I suspect since it's imminent and there's a change being made October 1st, where a third of the SROs get cut. I suspect, if the mayor does support this, we may see it in the Budget Support Act, coming up this year. So even though it's not a dollars and cents issue, we may see it.
Well, I would say that I included, and since it was a Ward 7 letter, I only asked for money for Ward 7. I did some rough math to how much these people could cost if I wanted one in every single of my schools, because I was anticipating another SRO cut. And so I said, hey, how much would it cost if I just did, because I figured she might be trying to negotiate it down. But how much would it cost if every single one of my schools had a safety advocate person? And can the mayor like literally put that in the budget? So that was so I do think there are ways to do it if that was something we could agree to, or like if we wanted to go the task force route or other things, and we don't have to decide all of it tonight. We can put the things down. We have other things to move to. This is why I kept y'all at 3, honestly. But we have other things to move through, but we can go back and forth on email. But I wanted to get a sense of people putting on the table, like what the guardrails were. So thank you all for that. I do want to move to safe passage within this bucket if anybody has strong feelings on safe passage, or at least clarifying things. Like, so when we say safe passage, do we need expanded hours? Do we need expanded sites? Do we need other things for safe passage? Are there things people want to put on the table that would be helpful around that? Representative Reed.
Expanded sites for the bodies, the people that bring us, as well as training. I think they did a great job of getting people out there, but the training component of, are they all standardized for certain things? And then a part of that also that the microtransit still is part of safe passage. So wherever routes are still needed. And then in my ward letter, I included like activity buses, also. So safe passage expand beyond just getting kids to from school, but also getting them to come back to the leave.
Thoughts?
I think hours is an issue too. Hours for the safe passage staff.
Like when you say hours, you mean after school, before school, like?
I think mainly after school,
Okay.
being able to extend the day would be helpful.
I know I did a youth budget, well, it wasn't just you, but I had you come to my budget listening session. One of the things that had not dawned on me before, which I'm glad someone said to me, and I know, is that seniors a lot of times have half-day schedules. And that there's nobody out there at the half-day mark. And so like I would include things like that in the expansion of hours. I've also heard from many of my safe passage providers that if they had the funding, they would like to do a better job of like when summer school is happening. Since many times we do summer school, we're bringing communities together. That would not only be together during the school year. So I would include that as an expansion to safe passage. Right. Happy to keep us going, even though I can't. Okay. Was there anything else under the school safety bucket? So we covered safe passage. We covered, thank you all for leaning in on the conversation around like SROs and that type of school safety. Was there anything else in the safety bucket, or can I move on to the other one?
Just quickly around, so kind of like the perimeter, and this might not be a budget thing, but like, I know people go back from seeing SROs, people inside of schools, outside of schools. I will say one constant is what's happening around schools in a presence of somebody or people around the schools. So it might be more of an oversight thing, but yeah, like what happens for lockdowns, would it help, be helpful to just have people out and about? Also making people, I guess, like the violence interrupted thing, like people around the community, make people aware that there's a school right here. I do believe no matter what you are doing in society, they respect that children are there. And, you know, maybe just have a conversation with some community members about, you know, they too are part of the safe passage, regardless of what they're doing out and about around school. So definitely something about like, around buildings. What does that look like in regards to securing? I'm not gonna do it safe blocks, but for the safety versus traffic safety. Community safety.
Also, Councilmember Pinto has a roundtable happening on Friday. And so you were all able to testify as public witnesses at that hearing, which is about public safety, gun violence. So if that's something you want to raise, then I feel like that would be a good time to bring things up to council on that. Wouldn't be budget specific, but it would be something on it. But it's one opportunity.
She's also doing it on Saturday. Yeah. I'm gonna move us to the next bucket so we can continue to move along. It looks like what came in next, I assume that's what you're doing.
Probably, honestly, probably the school adequacy piece, because the programmatic piece is kind of three very distinct type things.
Okay.
But I think school adequacy would probably be the most appropriate to.
All right, let's go there.
So I sent everybody a spreadsheet just moments ago here that's got all the schools on it. This is something I put together based on the initial school budgets. And what you'll see here is you'll see the mark DCPS gave everyone, and I've grouped it by ward. So you can see where your ward is for every school. You'll see here in the percent change column, the first one, you know, where your schools went. And the floor, like 5% cuts are frequent. I think 47 schools received a 5% cut. And even schools that grew by, you know, enrollment, you know, oftentimes received a cut. So I proposed something really simple here, which is a 5% increase to make sure no school's buying power is reduced. I think that that's really important. And, you know, where I get to with that, I mean, you look at certain, like Ward 8 only went up by 0.67%, you know, by ward. You know, Ward 7 went up by only 1.01, you know, Ward 6 by 1.45, you know, Ward 5, you know, went up a lot, but they had, you know, increases in students that went up by 7.79, and you can just go down the list. I think the point is that, you know, we just did 2 hearings on this subject. I think you testified on the first one, and parents are really upset about this. They've worked with their LSATs. They've seen what these cuts actually mean to their schools, and it means they're losing staff. If you have a smaller elementary school, you're losing significant staff because you can't take an elementary school class of, 25 kids or 20 kids, and then split that. If you got 3 classes of 20, you can't turn that into 2 classes of 30 and not have a big impact if you have to cut that teacher. So it's really being felt hard there. The high schools can absorb it better, but that's simply by increasing class sizes. And that's not a good thing either. So, I mean, I've proposed here, the cost of this though, if you want to give 5% to every school, and then of course you have to match the charters, it's 43.5 million on the DCPS side. And then it's about 42 million on the charter side for the match. So that comes out to about 85 million. And we just saw the revenue estimate. It went down $81 million. So it's going to be a tight fiscal year. The economy is really slowing down. I was the budget director during the Great Recession for the council. And the number one thing we did was, if you don't start new programs, try to not cut what you have. And I think the number one thing this board could put a word out for is not cutting the buying power of our local schools. It's what the parents want. And I think that should be the priority.
Other thoughts?
So why not just have the UPSFF higher? Like why not that rather than the 5% for every school?
Who can I answer that? It would.
Yeah.
So the UPSF, I didn't try to calculate backward as to what that would be. Let's say we add 5% to each of the local school budgets. The UPSFF, I think the mayor said it went up by 5.05%. We could try to calculate that. That was about 144. So if we cross multiply, I mean, I could do a crude math on that. Maybe it goes up by 7% or something
It doesn't
like
really
that.
matter.
But yeah, that's how we
Same
would do it.
place.
Yeah, that's exactly how we would do it. We'd be telling DCPS, put this towards the local schools, don't put it to central. And I'll get you the multiplication.
That's all right.
When we say school adequacy, what do we mean?
That's what I'm asking you all.
Okay, no, because I was just saying that the term, I'm going into like, I guess in my head, I'm thinking like, there are just certain things that, are basic amenities, and then there's just certain enhancements even that certain schools will need. When I testified at the youth hearing on Saturday, Councilmember Pinto asked me a question that still is kind of like lingering in my head about like, all right, we do a budget formula that's not just based on students, even though the enrollment number, what does it look like? And I was like, good question. Let me circle back to you. I'm also thinking, and then as I kept thinking about it, I'm wondering, it's no silver bullet, but like, could schools be funded based on like community demographics? So no, a school might not be breaking at the seams by their numbers, but that there's a certain need that students are going to come with. There's a chance that there's a certain need that students are going to come with based on certain demographics of, there are certain numbers related to poverty or whatever other matrices that are around. So I just wanted to kind of set this up, like, when I hear adequacy, I'm like, what does that mean? And I'm not like being contradictory. I'm just like, do we just want to be adequate, or do we want to really, not saying that everybody's going to have like platinum walls, but also like they're making, again, just tough decisions. There's just be like, why are we making these decisions? We should just have these things because the principals have deemed it appropriate for their learning environments.
I have thought here, I'll go back to our opinion today, and then I'm going to try.
I just want to even agree with everything you said there. I think, for me, it's making sure that if a school is losing population, you don't create a downward spiral at that school. So making sure that, if, there's a 1-year blip and a school loses students, you don't pour on the cut in a way that, just makes the school, just lose more students the next year. I think the council tried to get at this, and I support the spirit of what they did with this legislation, the Schools First and Budgeting Act. But I don't think there's any, I asked the Attorney General to look at it and give us an opinion on it, because I don't think there's any way it's legally sufficient. We looked at this issue extensively when I was the budget director for the council, and it's the mayor's prerogative to be able to propose a budget. And as soon as the council starts dictating the numbers, they've overstepped. But just to what Representative Henderson said, it would be 8.05%. So we'd have to go up by 3% to be able to put the 5% back to every school. So no school gets a cut in buying power. And the schools will get money through workforce investment that hasn't been transferred over yet. They weren't able to transfer that funding prior to the local school budgets being submitted. So more money will come over, but it will be just to keep the schools even with the buying power from the 12% raises. So I think, just long story short, I want the schools to be able to have the same purchasing power they did before the raises.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple parts to this. I'm glad you mentioned purchasing power. So like, I thought about, I know that this year, those raises will be absorbed by the workforce investment tax. Like, it doesn't, so like, they'll be absorbed there. In general, I think purchasing power is important as inflation goes up. And I think our UPSF should at least keep pace with inflation. So like that, I think is a different approach to what is adequate in a budget. But like, I know the mayor said 5.05, I think she said, and I'm like, all right, well, if inflation is closer to 7, then we should be looking at 7%. That seems logical to me. I think there's also, I have some uneasiness around the budget conversation that we're having school by school at the moment, because I also know enough to know that we're only talking about DCPS's preliminary budgets, which means that these budgets aren't final. And so these numbers will change. And so I get why the council was like, hey, what's up, DC, with your budgets, DCPS? And I know literally over the course of the next couple of weeks, those numbers will be different. At the same time, we are not talking about the full equation, because not just because they're preliminary budgets, but even CPS is only one piece of our education system. One of my real concerns is that we tend to have these budget conversations about what's adequate for schools, divorced from the fact that we just continue to say we're going to have as many schools as we want to have. And we don't have a blank check for schools. So I don't know how we can have blanket authorization and no blank check. Those things don't go together to me. And so I also, last thing I'll say about this is, I also am very concerned about how the citywide narrative plays out around budgets and what it looks like in different wards. Like in Ward 7, I represent Ward 7. We have had for years schools who have had budget cuts for varying reasons. And with quite frankly, when I run the numbers, and I lean on some people to help me run the numbers, we did better with the chancellor's initial budget allocations than many of my schools would have done with the students first. That is like, I do think there's a certain amount of nuance that we are not applying to the budget conversation because of shifting demographics. And a lot of times people want to run, oh, wait a minute, my school had 300 people this year, and now they have 275 people, or now they have 325 people, as if all those people are the same. And they're not. So if you are losing an ELL population and your school is becoming wealthier and whiter, and we have a commitment to student-based budgeting that is based in equity, because we actually weight at-risk students, at a different number as we should, that matters. That's not one-to-one, right? Like if you are, like, so those things matter, and we are not at all having that type of conversation. I really think that and this may be a different budget thing, and maybe this is something we can introduce as, I don't know if it's part of the BSA or no, or whatever. DCPS needs to do a better job of when they release those budgets, saying for real how they got there. Like if they literally said, hey, Ambiers, and the Ambiers like Ambiers, but students are actually up. I'm very confident, because I tend to be confident about things, but I'm very confident we can remedy Ambiers budget cuts before this final budget comes out. I feel good about that. But if they said, hey, Ambiers, the reason why you're facing a budget cut this year is because we're projecting that most of your SPED students are graduating and you're not going to replace them with SPED students, that would help people understand what the allocations need to be. Not saying that's the actual case, but like, we don't have that level of transparency. So it really concerns me. I do think that like buying power is important for everyone, which is why I again took the UPSF approach, and I'm gonna wait a bit on the DCPS budget as far as like what I need to see, like outside of saying to talking with my schools and my LSAT and reaching out to the chancellor when appropriate to say, hey, here's what I'm hearing, because the ball's still in their court. And these budgets aren't final, and in some ways, it's a bit of premature information, and I hope many of these things can be made right before the full budget is released. I don't know where that gets us.
That was great.
I would say that the thing that I share is that we can focus on the buying power. I do think we have consensus around that.
And by my calculation, you need 8.05% outside of workforce investment to hit the buying power number, because we got a 12% raise over 4 years for teachers, a 12.5% raise over 4 years for principals. And that still doesn't include the bump that teachers would presumably get this year for the next school year in 24, because they would probably get the same 4% principals did. Principals negotiated 4% for school year 23-24. And presumably, let's just assume teachers match that. So that's really about a 16% raise, per teacher. So, I think if you hit the 8.05% number on the UPSFF, and the mayor puts the full workforce investment funding that she promised, I think you can keep the buying power even. But that's a big investment. That's 80+ million dollars you got to put into that in a tight fiscal climate.
I think one of the things that I am never quite sure what to do with, because my guess is that someone who's not a legal scholar, that there probably are some different opinions, but I'm clear on what the council's interpretation of the law is that anytime they give DCPS money, they want to give charters money too. Which I'm not against charters having adequate budgets, but I'm very clear that the W-2 raises only have to be true for DCPS. And so what are we saying if we're like budgeting for DCPS raises that are going to teacher personnel, and we're saying everybody gets a raise across the board? Like, what does that mean for like being added, like fair to schools?
I mean, I can give you my personal answer on it. I mean, for me, anything that goes through the formula, which I would not include facilities. I wouldn't include programs that are separate, like our school nurse funding, which is done through DC Health.
Correct.
But just my personal opinion on the formula was we have two separate ways of treating facilities. One is the facilities allotment, which we give to charters. The other is capital borrowing, which we do for DCPS. They're roughly equivalent. I think any other funding, in my opinion, should flow through UPSFF. It should be matched, and that's just the way I've always felt about it, whether it's retroactive or not. Because I mean, in this case, if we look at teacher salaries, let's say DCPS negotiated these raises on the school year like they should have. Like, let's say there wasn't a 3 or 4 year backlog, that would have been within the formula back then. Those raises will be part of what we're spending on DCPS. So if we wait 3 or 4 years to give the raises, and then we give it, to them retroactively, that should still be matched to charters, in my personal opinion, because if it was done on time, it would have been through the formula, and it's something that is part of the school's operating budget. So other thing, lastly on this is, I would be really worried if we start, or the council starts, not we, but the council starts trying to cut charters out of the formula. I think you really risk congressional interference if you start doing that. If you start trying to tinker with that right now, I think you're going to risk Congress getting involved, and I don't want that. I think we want them out of our business. So that's just my take on it.
No other thoughts?
I mean, I think it generally is important to consider this approach cross-sector, and I appreciate what you were saying about the push for transparency within DCPS. I think there's not consensus on what approach we have, like annually, and how we are viewing the new negotiated contracts within DCPS for both teachers and principals. And so I think pushing for clarity in any of this, even if we're not trying to be prescriptive, but just inquisitive, like would be useful in broadening a better citywide conversation?
I'm going to move us along. That's kind of the programmatic preference. And I think that's the last one that we're gonna do tonight. It is.
Do we have the link to this? Or do we give the link to the Jam board?
No, they don't, but we can share it. Jam board. We'll share the notes. And it might not be the jam board, but no, we did not show the link to this because Alex literally put it in real time. We'll share the notes. All right, programmatic, we have absolute time. We have full implementation of pre-K. We have literacy. Anybody want to jump in?
Just want to link, one of my principals responded that the piloting activity buses, or that transportation piece is key for if you ask for more out of school time funding, getting kids to those programs. So she was supporting it, but she essentially was like, you can ask more funding, but they can't get to the programs, it's forgotten. So that's all I would offer for that.
One of the things that I try to think about when I write my budget request is like where you want the funding to go. I don't know if people have strong thoughts about that, like if it's like they want PPR programs, if they want programs at the schools, like the money to go to, you know, DME to do the, or programs like, do you know what I'm saying? And so I'm curious, like, if there was if we advocated for increasing out of school time, which I have heard from a lot of families is something they want. If you all have received any feedback from where those programs should be, and maybe it's a mix, because I know families have a mix of ways that they are, you know, getting to and from and all the things. But what's the first thing?
I think that there's 3 different ways I think we should categorize this. I think the first is EPR, because they have a lot of like great rec centers and stuff, but like at least everyone at my school just spends all day in the rec center. So that's what I will say. I think it'd be great to have more collaboration with them so that like because rec centers are great spaces and they have so many services, to have other spaces or to have easier ways for students to get to and from these rec centers and make sure they have good facilities and things like that, so they have the capacity to have more programs. Another thing that I think is important to invest in I think that it's not often in the conversation of out of school time because it's only during the summer is SYEP. And making sure that students feel inclined to join that. And I know that one of the barriers and a lot of reasons my friends don't do that and opt for kind of more intense summer jobs or not doing a summer job at all is because the pay minimum there is not actually in line with BC minimum wage. It's lower. And yeah, it's like $6.25 an hour, depending on your age. And I understand that the programs are kind of different. But I think that like increasing the capacity of SYEP to have like better funding might encourage or incentivize more students doing that. And then I think we can also look at like other community partners, places like Urban Adventure, that have access to like specialized things for different groups specialized in certain things outside of DPR that could do more work specifically in schools. So I think we split up into those 3 categories that might be helpful.
I have heard direct feedback, and also that rec center, that close to the school by chance. That everyone goes to.
Yes,
Okay.
it's right by our school.
Because I was wondering, okay, because it ties on to what I was thinking about before. I have heard feedback from probably like 3 years ago now, student Anacostia, and then at the youth hearing on Saturday, students asked for those programs like at the schools. I guess it'd be because they're there. They said it's a piece of the safety where they're like, we don't want to leave the building to get to it. They want to, and even things like washing machine, like things that they can just use that might not be adequate at home. But they were interested in having their food space transformed to like a recreation space because usually they're there anyway, hanging out, and then but they don't have anything like to do.
Can that be tied to like community school funding?
Say that again.
Can that be tied to community school funding? Because isn't the whole point of community schools to have those things after school, whether they're laundry services, after school programs, community family and parent engagement.
I just know those are from high school students for that, the two comments that I heard.
Well, I think community schools as an approach is different than out of school time programming. Yes. It's important, but I think it's different. I think another thing that I've heard from families who do not attend school in my ward is when they are attending schools in other parts of the city that have more affluent populations, there are not enough slots. Like, you know, free slots or subsidized slots at their school. Which seems to be a funding issue if somebody's paying for it. So I think there's an opportunity there.
A grandparent had that issue where they were offered, I think the school picked up a provider that made them, they switched from taking vouchers to doing a what is it, a sliding fee scale, but grandma was like, well, I have 3 children at the school, that sliding fee scale becomes like for nothing. So also with not just the funding, though, too, with implementation from OSCE, because OSCE's kind of response was the private provider has their right to pick which funding streams that they want. And I was wondering, because OSCE, what is it, certifies out of school time providers, if there is some way that OSCE can incentivize them. Because basically, I think it was something about the private provider was like, they take a hit. So it's like if OSCE can kind of stand in the gap of making sure people are trained and getting their vouchers, or.
When you say, so I think I would need some more detail to better understand with that.
Yeah,
So like,
I have to pull it, I'm trying to pull the details from my head from like almost 2 years ago. So you have to, as an out of school time provider, OSCE, I guess, certifies them, but to take vouchers, it's a, what is it, elective process. Like the out of school time provider does not have to elect to learn how to do the voucher process. So what happens in the school level is if the school decides they want, or the school community decides they want a provider who doesn't take vouchers, then the parents are kind of up the creek, or they might have a voucher be eligible, but the school, the out of school time provider won't take those. So it's kind of like, can OSCE in their process of mandating, or OSCE in their process of credentialing these out of school time providers also mandate that they take voucher, like they just get certified to vouchers. Right now, the response is, it's up to the out of school time provider to get that voucher. Or get that credential.
I think we will have to.
I agree, Frazier, it's not. So families have these vouchers, but if they go to a school that doesn't elect, and it's also what you're saying, right, President Thompson, it's a school that, you know, is close to the work. So presidents or even parents are fine with paying for that providers, but this parent was from my ward. So in Ward 8, my principal was like, yeah, we don't have programs that charge anything, they can just come. But his parents going to school outside the ward, and they're in a school that's, you know, people are like, oh, we'll pay a little money. And the grandparents like, well, actually, they're athletes off the side of fee scale, that still puts me in a deficit for 3 children in a school.
That doesn't sound very.
I think, I hear what you're saying, and I think that we probably would have to do some homework on like what that means and could look like. So a long time ago now, I used to run an after school program out of a DCPS school. We did after school, we did summer programs, I also had a home visiting program. And yeah, like it's totally up to us, and it was a nonprofit, but like we had funding streams from OSCE. We never explored like the voucher thing, but of course, like because it is a private, like technically private entity, of course you have choices about like what meets your bottom line.
Right.
We were doing that for free, and so I think we would have to think about like what that could look like.
Like how to incentivize them so they can make money off their business, but then also make it.
Well, it's just like covering your bottom line, right?
Yeah.
So like being able to pay your employees and like all the things are real. So and also it would, in some instances, it might mean like when you change, it might mean have real implication for what funds people go after. And like there are some things there. So like I think we would probably have to do some homework around why this is happening, what's happening. And or we
let me think about it. Let us think about it, because there's probably multiple ways to approach it.
Yeah, even with like maybe superintendent grant may have some. It's not like, it's more.
Because I mean, clearly, I'm like, I raised it as a thing that happened, so but I also want to be like putting something on the table that can happen in response.
Yeah.
Anything else about OLT, noting that we have also in this bucket, literacy and something else,
Pre-K.
pre-K, thank you. All right. Let's move on to literacy. Thoughts?
Yeah, lots of thoughts. So, I think this is a strategic question for everyone in the room. The task force seems to be moving forward, so thank you for our leadership for nudging there. And definitely for participating actively in this last. Great. So there's a broader ask that's coordinated with other agencies that will be hopefully a good one that we feel great about at the end of this.
Is that the end of the summer?
Yeah.
Okay.
September. So I think the question is, what are pieces of the puzzle that we want to stress? Does it make sense to stress pieces that we want to see in that now in detail? Does it make sense to name things that support the task force and the work that they're doing, or does it make more sense to hold off?
So I would say you probably know more than anybody else about what is happening inside of the task force, right? In this one. I anticipated a recommendation from the task force based on the timelines you have shared. The approach I personally took was the mayor should hold funds in anticipation of recommendations from the task force in the FY24 budget, because I had no way of calculating what that might be or what that would include or where the money would go. But all the people, like, I would assume that Dr. Grant could talk to the mayor and say, here's what would be most realistic. I'm just gonna be transparent and say, I didn't have enough information to make an intelligent guess on the number of funds or like the number of funds or where they would go. So that was the approach I personally took. But I don't know if there are people who like have other approaches that make sense that they want to put on the table, or if there's more information that you have that could help us ask for something more specific.
There's a much more specific ask, which Dr. Reed put in her letter, which, if I may pass to you today, comes from information that Kathleen gathered from letters, the Voyager Silver's team. One piece, just to contextualize this, though, that is one of the providers of structured literacy is what Mississippi mandated for every student, right? And so the results is the gold standard. It is what Mary Clayman from the DC Beauty Clinic said is the baseline for what she built in DCPS. And I'll pass to you actually, Dr. Reed, to name what you included in your budget letter.
Yeah, sure, that one, 6.6 million. And that is training for like 1,000. Between administrators and educators, almost like 2,000 personnel for early learning providers. More? Okay, I was just trying to get that.
Or pre-K, 3,500 for K to 5, 750 administrators. I sort of got those numbers.
I'm gonna be honest with him, I cannot understand a word you're saying, but I want to.
So those numbers are, that number is based on an estimate that I made based off OSSE's educator workforce report of how many pre-K educators, K to 5 educators, and admin overseeing those, which could be principals, vice principals, but also like coaches. who would need to be trained, that I rounded up. I felt like it was probably better to do that than to be surprised by like, oh, actually, we need more. And it's really hard to tell in there, you don't know like which people are specifically designated for which grade level, so those are like very rounded estimate. But it is for about 5,000 people in those various categories.
You look confused, so
I can send you the like numbers.
So pro tip, never try to read my face. 'Cause, it could be, I'm actually not confused. I think what I'm thinking, transparently, what I'm thinking, is in one fiscal year, are we really going to train 5,000?
Right.
No.
Or is that an ask over several years?
What I think is super
And-
helpful about knowing those
Yes.
details is actually, I think, building off of what you named, if we're gonna say, hey, please set aside some money. Because by the time the recommendations from the task force come out, we're past this, we're past this budget cycle, right? So
Correct.
then it would be delayed another year, which just I find infuriating, right? So if the budget ask is, you know, lock this amount, no, as a guess, I mean, does that get to where we need to be enough that it creates the optionality of it, and then also still creates room for the task force to make it as a coordinated ask?
I think the task force responsibilities also include recommendations around a timeline for implementing the training.
Right.
So that likely will not be everyone is trained right now at the beginning. Other states haven't been doing that thing they're saying.
Right. Well,
Certain
that's-
demographics over a certain period of time, this would be the total for all of those teachers, like.
Yes.
That's what that estimate is.
I understood that, and that's why I said my face was not confusion. It was because I understood that I was starting to then ask subsequent questions. I think, and we have had this conversation in the chain. I do think that there is a balance that we are trying to achieve between like being proactive and pushing to get the things done without like, while respecting the work and the process that needs to go into it. I'm going to defer to you as the person who sits in those spaces most often to say, if you feel like this is the ask that A, achieves the work, and B, is not like the board is going before the task force and saying what the recommendations will be. Do you know what I mean? Since it is still information.
I think it's, I mean, what Kathleen did is I think really thoughtful math as a guesstimate.
Completely agree with that.
Right? It's very thoughtfully calculated. The challenge is, I mean, what you're naming though is, it doesn't fit in a budget ask without a number. And it jumps ahead of the task force if we propose a number. So
this is an enigma, right?
Question for clarification. Whenever the budget process happens, are there ever items that like are budgeted for future or multi-year?
So facility items are budgeted for multi-year in the capital budget. And then there are times where you kind of like make a announcement that like, this is a spend, what we will do, you set it up for per year. So that is a thing where you can like describe it that way. Yeah, so the answer is yes, but it does not appear in the budget in numbers. Like when you go into the budget document, you read like the justification, the dialogues around things, like if you want to get real into the nitty-gritty, which I personally like to, but I'm weird like that.
I'm not a budget person by any stretch of the imagination. But it seems to me that the urgency that I'm getting from you, Representative Chang, is that we need to do something about contemplating some figure or some urgent ask. Because you're talking about how uncomfortable you would be if it would be 24-25 school year. And we're already talking about the 24-25 budget almost. What can you do to get, the task forces are gonna be for a while now with a template? Is it realistic for us to even think about an amount for this budget?
I mean, that's where Kathleen's estimate, I think, is the closest we got. I'd actually love to hear Dr. Henderson and other members, what your thought is on this.
I don't see the harm in proposing, highlighting it and proposing a number or saying that the number could be flexible ahead of the task force. Like, because I think that just highlights the urgency. I mean, yes, like we don't want to misspend money in any like superfluous way, but at the same time, like we're also talking about literacy. We're also talking about the place where we're at as a city on literacy. And we're talking about literacy that is based on research and we know has been effective in what the work is actually proposing. So I think, you know, I love the complexity of the conversation. I think these are serious questions that need to be asked. But at the same time, like we also need to move the work forward urgently, and kicking the can down the road because we don't feel like we have a specific amount, like isn't serving kids or schools. That's my 2 cents.
Because we can't wait.
Yeah.
For the task force.
OSCE would be able to provide specific numbers of people who will be able to do it for like research and information purposes. I made some estimates of how many people, but they have the information on how many teachers there are on specific things. And so would be able to come to like a more specific and actually accurate to reality. Number.
Were you about to jump in?
Yeah, I was gonna say, my tendency is to err towards the like push. And also, maybe I don't know all the details, but like, is there potential, like, if we're starting now, we can use ESSER funds for the first part of it. Even if there's more to come later. But my instinct is to push, but I hear you saying balance, that's kind of my tendency.
I think what I would offer as a potential. I'm not quite sure compromise is the right word here, but I think what I'm pushing for a couple of things. One is I'm completely comfortable with us saying we want to set aside funds. I don't think that we will train 5,000 educators in one fiscal year. I think it'll be, I think that's not real. And I'm confident, and it's not about wasting funds, it's just about being as realistic as possible in our ask. I think that we would say that's the total number spent up to this amount spent over whatever years. And we would acknowledge that our desire is to leave room for the task force recommendation. And so I think the needle I'm trying to thread here is following things. One, I tend to get a bee in my bonnet when something is my work and someone jumps ahead of my work. And I know that that's something we've been trying to manage as carefully as possible with this work. And when I feel like I don't want to upset that, because I also want the money there when the work is done, but I want the work done. So we can then spend the money. I want to be transparent about that. I also want us to put forward, like I said, like realistic recommendations. And I do think this is a multi-year effort. And so I want to represent that this is a multi-year effort, and I want to leave room for any other recommendations the task force has, with an acknowledgement that there may be other things in addition to letters, whatever it is, that come out of the task force, and we invite the mayor to hold funds for those things.
I think they're the devils in the details, right? So if we covered this earlier, that this letter is being drafted by our staff, right? So to the staff, do you feel like you've gotten enough from this conversation to feel comfortable with drafting a
Oh, wait a minute, don't ask Kathleen,
No, you don't ask me, I'm not.
because she's not the person that's gonna do the draft. So,
I'll
yeah, so it's, yeah, like, cause that puts Kathleen on the spot in a way of something she's not going to do. I would say, here's what's gonna happen, put everything on the table.
Yeah.
We will have notes like like we do for everything else. When there are questions, like we send in any other letter, and I know the staff does this for me, they will literally put in the comments, I have a question about this, right? And we will all have opportunities to chime in. I just say, don't ask Kathleen, because Kathleen's not drafting the budget letter, so it's not a question of if she has, you know what I mean? If she's not the staff that's doing it. But if there are other things y'all want to put on the table that I think are helpful, I would invite that.
Well, the other contextual piece to add to this is we're ramping up year after year by a relatively small amount compared to every other jurisdiction. The number of teachers that get trained in the 3 different kinds of structured literacy training we've got going on in the city right now. That's TNTP, letters, and DC reading. And so my expectation is that that number should be going up incrementally still. Whether or not that fits in with what the task force decides at the end is the one thing that we actually do, right? Is it ramp up all 3? Is it choose one and go with it? Is it all LEAs get to choose whichever one that they stipend, enforce compliance? All of those things are still up in the air. It is unclear, right? And I think that's part of this coordinated ask that so there is still the please support the increase of these 3 things that I feel really good about, and it jumps ahead of whatever the task force decides at the end.
I don't see a downside to that.
Because that's just my preference. I mean, I think this is why I said and leave room for the things. And then there's also a certain level of like, some of these things are going to be for the executive to decide. Like, I mean, yeah. So if there is if you have some language that you want to submit around an incremental ask, cool. But I would say I feel uncomfortable with saying the task force is going to, because I don't know what the task force is eventually going to recommend. Just like when we talk about like the social studies standards, like I can say I feel confident, or like I feel like we're heading in the right direction, but I can't say the board will vote to confirm OSCE social studies. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's the same respect I demand to this body, I try to give to others.
We need to have something quickly that explains what we've been talking about. So it can be all kinds of side things that aren't in there. All right, this is going to happen and mention the tech, but I really think the task force shouldn't be mentioned as much in the ask.
Okay, so then what do we think about the proposal to ask for funding to increase the incremental ask for increasing these 3 trainings that we already have, and set aside the money that Kathleen estimated for the next year?
I estimated the number of teachers, letters responded with the actual numbers for the money.
Yeah, if we as a board, separate from the task force recommendation, if you would like us, and members are happy to do so, ask for an increase in the training, that is fine. We can do that as a board. We can. I think I am saying that like we cannot say on behalf of the task force. Can't do that.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
That's the last part I did here.
I'm saying we cannot do that on behalf of the task.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
All right. I think Representative Levin was presented at a ANC meeting. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on the pre-K. If not, then I'm going to invite him to send some comments via email. And then the other things we will include in the notes And that way, if people want to contribute to those things, we can do so via email in the interest of time. Is that okay? Yes. Okay. All right. I don't know if anyone else is slowing down, but
Are we transitioning to committee reports?
we are transitioning to a bunch of things. We still have new business, which is the two. I'm sorry. What's the, I don't want to. It probably is at this point. Yeah. No, it doesn't.
Can I make a quick announcement as we transition?
Something happens to this.
All right, so in lieu, as we're figuring this out, I'd like for the board to also be aware that on top of today,
Oh, I have a feeling I know what you're gonna say
yes,
now.
receiving the Coca-Cola Scholarship, our fellow representative. She also received and was named Debater of the Year by the National Association of Urban League Debates. Who selected one person across the entire country, and that was Representative Lee Birdseye.
She
So,
also finished her free Coca-Cola here.
Not free. I think $2.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
That was
You should get a line or something like that.
There was a whole truck at the
The
school
whole
then, and I
Coca-Cola truck was
excited
there,
about
and Coca-Cola beer was there, and you had to pay for your Coke.
it. Yeah, the Coca-Cola bear was there, and so was the
Oh, you
Fraser.
need to get some free Cokes to leave.
students were thoroughly disappointed when the truck drove off without giving anything. We had to explain to them that it was for show.
That's, so we have three committee reports. One I think is, I know is extremely short. So I'm gonna turn to Vice President O'Leary for the admin report.
We will meet on Monday with the first time that the admin committee will meet, and we will send a note to you soon thereafter. Thank you very much.
I want to turn to Representative Delay to update us on the bylaws work.
Well, thank you so much. We had a great first meeting. I think we've got a second one coming up. When's our second meeting?
Today. It was today.
It was today. I was in the hearing. I didn't know it was today. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. Well, that's embarrassing. You guys did it now. So, I mean, good God. I thought we were doing it like, I thought we were gonna set these. I didn't know we had another one. So this is a regular meeting then, not just a one time. All right, well, I don't know. I'll have to say, but I think the first meeting was excellent. So the first meeting was excellent. I've got to catch up over the weekend on this stuff. But, you know, what we did is we looked through all the recommendations that all the board members gave, and we put those together. And, you know, Carlin, maybe you can give a better update than I can on how this went today, but I'm gonna spend some time over the weekend, so we get something to look at. I want to actually get a draft ready for you all to look at the retreat. And that way, you know, you can look through, you know, see if we're on the right track. And I'm going to share it with my committee members as soon as I get it done this weekend. So that way we can figure that out. But I mean, I thought it was really great progress, all the same mindset of trying to move forward, you know, making sure the students have a voice in this, and then making sure that we're not creating processes that we can't stick with and that just slow things down for us. Anything that, you know, we formalize should be something that makes our lives easier versus just creating process for process's sake. So, you know, Representative Reed, do you want to add anything to that? And I got to go on an apology tour for missing that thing today. I was in the hearing. I didn't know we'd scheduled it formally. So apologies to you guys.
We were hoping we can get that red line for Saturday if you can. And,
Yeah. Saturday?
yeah, and then probably on Saturday, we would like to explore, getting feedback from members on SOP ideas, so we can come with those.
We have a retreat on Saturday. I think that's what they're. Yeah.
I'm aware of that.
You know where it is?
Actually, I don't. I put my camera.
It's
It's not like in another state, is it, or something like that? I think
It is
like
not.
Florida.
I'm gonna take you off the hot seat, Roxanne.
That's all right. I don't mind being on the hot seat.
No worries.
I live on the hot seat.
The last thing is external committee. I think two things are important. One is we will do, we'll talk about all the external committee placements at the retreat. Some of them are already filled, some of them are new. We followed up with the staff to make sure some of the committees still existed, like Everyday Counts, because they had their meeting. So before we just started saying like, oh, do you want to be a part of this? Do you want to be a part? We needed to clean the list. Some things have sunset. So we will talk about that then, just like we did for the admin and the bylaws. We have to then do a resolution to install people into committees. One committee appointment that I guess is a bit of it's a legacy appointment. I serve on NASB's what is that? Policy and Education Positions Committee, we call it PEP. Every year, PEP does a survey of the members of the member states and asks what are the education positions that you think are important for NASB to take for the year. That survey was sent to my email. One person fills out the survey, so we do need to get one response. But what we'll do is we'll like just poll the members to see what they think, because it should be what the DC board thinks for the year. Not every rose like fills out the survey by herself. So I just want to flag that for you also, you know what it is. In the past, and literally we then, when we have the NASB conference, we explore like like we do research, we work in committees, all the things, but then NASB adopts those as the national positions for the year. So we've adopted things like digital literacy in the past, or science of reading, like there are different things. So it is an opportunity for other boards to say, all right, we want to do that too. So please look forward to that. I don't think there are other committee reports. Right.
Yes. One sentence or two sentences from the RPP. I guess it's also something to think we're going to still be on. Research Practice Partnership is what it's called. We met yesterday. They reviewed the process for reviewing research, like basically how we pick up topics. And then we entertained the first proposal for a research topic, which was related to access to Algebra 1 and DCPS and its relation to the number of students who successfully complete Algebra 1.
So, and then I'm assuming, did you have a question about that?
Yeah.
You have a committee report?
The Healthy Schools Network committee, that's an external committee. So anyway, we're meeting tomorrow.
And then
Literacy.
I attended the literacy task force yesterday, and I was excited to attend. We discussed a couple of things. There is a survey that will be going out to stakeholders. It'll be sort of branching, so it'll ask you your role if you're like a teacher versus like a family member versus community organization, and then it'll be questions based on that, and we review the questions for the survey. They are asking for support from the state board to disseminate that once it's complete. Next, we discussed what we would define as a structured literacy expert, since all teachers under the task force are supposed to have access to in-school support from a structured literacy expert. So we discussed what that actually means and to fill that role. And then we also discussed what teacher populations should be required or have the option to complete the training beyond the K-5, whether what would make us for preschool educators versus above grade 5, if there are certain teachers who it would make sense, such as ESL or Fed teachers also receive that training. And then they also shared a revised scope and sequence or like goals for the rest of the meetings. So that is a change since the original plan to share that. And I don't really have anything to report on this per se, because I believe that I'm here, but today there was also the NASB early literacy working group. So I attended the first 30 minutes of that, but I had to leave for this. But there will be notes we can share after.
Thank you. I feel like I'm coming to now, but there are no other committee reports. I'm gonna move us to our last item. For new business. It is the approval, the SR 23-2, which would be on the approval of the health standards agenda. Members, this is the opportunity to flag any additional things for discussion about the resolution as proposed. The staff has, of course, worked across to try to start with a like draft resolution for you all to provide feedback so that we are not responding to nothing. As the working sessions on board. So I want to invite comments and feedback on that draft so we can get to something we can propose to at the public meeting. Open in the floor. Yes.
Assistant Superintendent Bernstein mentioned that we are the first to do this, as DC is the first to do this, and I think it's worth noting in our resolution. I don't think I saw language around that. We're the first. So I think we should highlight that in the resolution. Fact check, of course, but I'm confident that we are.
Other thoughts? I know that one of the housekeeping items we have is to send the versions of the standards so that people know what we want to say, what we want the actual language to say and what we're voting on. That might be good. So we'll do that as well. Are there other thoughts on the resolution? That's just great. If you do have thoughts subsequent to this, of course, it's in your material. This email is always welcome. If there are no other announcements, we made our best announcement.
Very briefly, if anyone has things I'm missing from this, please let me know.
One other just announcement for people to know, SYE, they did extend the deadline to March 6th, since that came up tonight. If you are a member who said, yes, I would like a SYE fellow, there is an email in your inbox with the stuff that you need to do. It just came today, so no pressure. But just want to note that, and thank you to members who have raised their hand and said they will take SYE fellows. I really enjoy it. I'm going to. And then also, I think people know this, but if you're somebody who's been continuing to use the COVID test, please go to your library and get those tests because the emergency funding is up. So they will no longer be free. Like technically, I think it ended yesterday. But you might want to, and this is for the public as well, you might want to go to your library and pick up some of those free tests. The thing I don't know is like what will happen to the COVID center.
The COVID plans are still open.
For now.
For now.
Yes, okay. But grab the test. So if there are no other announcements, I don't see anybody motioning for an announcement. Yeah, sure.
All retreat details will be in your inbox tomorrow, the agenda, the location, so forth.
All right. And then I am going to ask that we go ahead and adjourn. This meeting of the state board is adjourned at 8. This is like the discipline gavel day at 8:27 p.m. Thank you.
Like to make a motion. Want to make a motion?
Wait, I'm sending a text message. Do you have my number? Yes. I texted you before on it and you've also responded on it.